Chapter 1. The Hidden Portrait. Harry Potter had thought, until roughly 6 hours ago, that magic didn't exist. The revelation had come courtesy of a giant man named Hagrid, who had broken down the door of a hut in the middle of the sea to rescue him from the Dursleys' increasingly desperate attempts to prevent him from receiving his Hogwarts letter. Now, standing in the marble entrance hall of a bank run by goblins, Harry was beginning to suspect that his understanding of the world was about as reliable as a chocolate teapot. "Right then, Harry," Hagrid said, his voice booming in the echoing space as he guided Harry toward a desk where a goblin sat behind a stack of ledgers. "Time to get you some money for your school things. Your parents left you well provided for. They did." Harry's stomach clenched at the mention of his parents. The Dursleys had told him they'd died in a car crash, but Hagrid had revealed the truth during the night. They'd been murdered by a dark wizard named Voldemort, who had tried and failed to kill Harry as well. The lightning bolt scar on his forehead, which the Dursleys had claimed came from the same crash, was actually the mark left by Voldemort's curse. He found himself touching the scar absently as they approached the goblin, who looked up at them with sharp, intelligent eyes. "Hagrid," the goblin said curtly. "Back again, are we? And this must be Harry Potter." "That's right," Hagrid replied. "We need to visit his vault, number 687. The goblin, his nameplate read Griphook, examined Harry with an expression that might have been curiosity. "Very well. Follow me." They were led through a maze of marble corridors to what Hagrid explained was a cart system that would take them down to the vaults. Harry gripped the sides of the rickety cart as it plunged through twisting tunnels deep beneath the London streets, his thoughts churning as wildly as his stomach. Everything he thought he'd known about his life had been turned upside down in the space of a single evening. His parents hadn't been unemployed drunks who died in a car crash. They'd been a witch and wizard who died protecting him. The cart finally screeched to a halt before a door marked with the number 687. "Key, please," Griphook said to Hagrid, who fumbled in his coat and produced a small golden key. As the goblin inserted the key and turned it, Harry heard a series of complex clicking sounds from within the lock mechanism. Then the door swung open and a cloud of green smoke billowed out. More than Harry would have expected, dense and shimmering with an otherworldly light. "Blimey," Hagrid muttered, waving his hand to clear the air. That's not quite normal, that is." Harry stepped forward into the vault, his eyes adjusting to the dim light. Piles of gold, silver, and bronze coins glittered in neat stacks around the chamber, more money than Harry had ever seen in his life. But there was something else, a sensation, like a gentle tugging in his chest, drawing him toward the back wall of the vault. "Go on then," Hagrid encouraged, though he sounded slightly uneasy. "Take what you need for your school supplies." Harry moved deeper into the vault, following that strange internal pull. Near the back wall, partially hidden behind a stack of gold galleons, something caught his eye. A small pile of coins that seemed to shimmer differently than the rest, as if they were catching light from a source that didn't exist. Without really thinking about why, Harry reached out and touched one of the unusual coins. The effect was immediate and startling. The green smoke that had been slowly dissipating suddenly swirled together, coalescing into a rectangular shape against the back wall. The smoke cleared, revealing what was unmistakably a magical portrait in an ornate frame. A portrait of a woman with Harry's green eyes and auburn hair that fell in gentle waves around her shoulders. The woman in the portrait blinked, her eyes focusing on Harry with an expression of overwhelming joy and sorrow intertwined. "Harry," she whispered, her voice carrying perfectly, despite the fact that she was speaking from within a painting. "My darling boy." Harry's knees nearly gave out. He'd never seen a photograph of his mother. The Dursleys had destroyed anything that might have reminded him of his parents. But he knew, with absolute certainty, that this was her. The shape of her face was so similar to his own, and those eyes. "Mum," the word escaped him as barely more than a breath. "Yes, sweetheart, it's me." Lily Potter smiled through what looked like tears. "I'm so sorry, Harry. So sorry I couldn't be there to watch you grow up. But I had to make preparations, in case the worst happened." "How is this possible?" Harry managed, his voice cracking. "Portrait magic," she explained gently. "I had this painted and enchanted to activate only when you touched your inheritance for the first time. I wanted to make sure no one else could access it, that it would only come to you when you needed it." "I need it?" Harry was aware that Hagrid was standing behind him, probably staring in shock, but he couldn't bring himself to care. This was his mother. She was speaking to him. Lily's expression grew serious. "Harry, there are things you need to know. Things about the war, about why your father and I died, about the people we trusted." Her voice dropped lower. "Not everything you've been told is the truth. There are people who should have protected you, who had their own reasons for the choices they made." "What do you mean?" "Albus Dumbledore," she said, and the name seemed to hang in the air like a warning. "I told several people before I died that they should never fully trust him. He's a brilliant man, and he fights against dark magic, but his methods—" She shook her head. "He believes the ends justify the means, no matter who gets hurt along the way." Harry felt as if the ground had shifted beneath his feet. Hagrid had spoken of Dumbledore with such reverence, describing him as the greatest wizard alive. "But he's the headmaster of Hogwarts. He's supposed to be good." "He is good in his way," Lily said carefully. "But he's also willing to sacrifice individuals for what he sees as the greater good. Promise me, Harry. Promise me you'll be careful. Ask questions. Don't trust blindly." "I promise," Harry whispered. Lily smiled sadly. "I know this is overwhelming. I wish I could explain everything. But this magic won't last long." Her eyes moved to something near Harry's feet. "Take the locket, the small gold one near where you're standing. It contains more memories, explanations. But be careful who you share them with." Harry looked down and saw a delicate gold locket half hidden beneath the shimmering coins. He picked it up, surprised by how warm it felt in his palm. "I love you," Lily said, her image already beginning to flicker and fade. "I'm so proud of you, my brave boy. Remember, question everything, trust carefully, and know that you are loved." The portrait dissolved into wisps of green smoke that dissipated within seconds, leaving only the ordinary stone wall behind. Harry stood frozen, clutching the locket, his heart pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. His mother. He'd actually spoken with his mother. "Harry?" Hagrid's voice was uncharacteristically subdued. "You all right there?" Harry turned around, trying to compose himself, but aware that his eyes were probably red. "Did you see that?" "I saw it," Hagrid said slowly. "Portrait magic, that was. But, Harry, what your mum said about Professor Dumbledore. You know him?" "Know him? Course I do. He's the greatest wizard there is, Harry. Saved my life once, he did, when I was wrongly accused of something terrible." Hagrid looked deeply troubled. "But your mum, she was a brilliant witch. Not the sort to make accusations lightly." Harry slipped the locket into his pocket, feeling its warmth against his leg. "She said I should ask questions." "Aye, she did," Hagrid agreed reluctantly. "Right then. Best we get your money and head up to Diagon Alley. You'll need your school things." He paused. "But Harry, Maybe we keep this between ourselves for now, eh? Until you've had time to think about what it all means." Harry nodded, filling a small bag with gold galleons, while his mind reeled. An hour ago, his biggest concern had been surviving another year with the Dursleys. Now he was apparently a wizard. His parents had been murdered by a Dark Lord, and his mother had warned him not to trust the most respected wizard in Britain. As they rowed the cart back up toward the surface, Harry's hand drifted to the locket in his pocket. Whatever his mother had meant about memories and explanations, he would discover soon enough. For now, it was enough to know that she had loved him, that she had tried to protect him even after her death. The world above ground seemed almost surreal after what had happened in the vault. Harry followed Hagrid through the crowds of Diagon Alley, half listening to explanations about wizard money and shopping lists, but part of his attention remained focused on the warm weight of the locket and the echo of his mother's voice. "Question everything," she'd said. "Trust carefully." Harry Potter, who had spent 11 years trusting no one, found that this was advice he could follow. Chapter 2. Diagon Alley Secrets. Harry found it nearly impossible to concentrate on shopping lists and school supplies when his mother's voice kept echoing in his mind. The cobblestone street called Diagon Alley stretched before them, lined with shops that looked like they belonged in a fairy tale, rather than London. Witches and wizards in pointed hats and flowing robes moved between the stores, some carrying owls, others levitating their packages behind them, with casual waves of wooden sticks that Hagrid had explained were wands. "Right then," Hagrid said, consulting a piece of parchment. "Got your Hogwarts list here. Need to get you robes first, then books, then a wand. Oh, and a cauldron, scales, all that." Harry nodded, but his attention was divided. The locket in his pocket seemed to pulse with warmth whenever he thought about his parents, a constant reminder that there were things he needed to understand. His mother had told him to ask questions, to be careful who he trusted. As they walked toward a shop called Madame Malkin's Robes for all occasions, Harry decided to start gathering information. "Hagrid," he said carefully, "you knew my parents at school, didn't you?" Hagrid's stride faltered slightly. "Well, not exactly at school, no. I'm a bit older than they were. But I knew them through my work at Hogwarts." "What were they like?" Harry pressed. "I mean, really like. Not just that they were brave and kind." They paused outside Madame Malkin's, and Hagrid's beetle-black eyes looked troubled. "Your mum was brilliant, Harry. Really brilliant. Always asking questions, always wanting to understand how things worked. Magic came easy to her, but she never took it for granted, if you know what I mean." "What kind of magic was she good at?" "Oh, all sorts. But she had a particular talent for protective magic. Charms to keep things safe, to hide things, that sort of thing." Hagrid's expression grew distant. "And your dad was brave as they come. Both of them were. They fought for what was right, even when it was dangerous." Harry absorbed this information as they entered the robe shop, while Madame Malkin bustled around him with pins and measuring tape. He found himself wondering what kinds of things his mother might have hidden. The portrait itself was evidence that she'd been planning for possibilities, preparing safeguards. Their next stop was Flourish and Blots, the bookstore. While Hagrid chatted with the clerk about Harry's required textbooks, Harry wandered through the aisles, ostensibly browsing but actually looking for anything that might help him understand what had happened in the vault. Near the back of the store, in a section marked Magical Theory and Practice, he found a slim volume titled Portrait Magic, Preservation of Memory and Personality. Without hesitating, he slipped it between his required books when Hagrid wasn't looking. "All set, then?" Hagrid asked, approaching with an armload of textbooks. "I think so," Harry said, his heart beating faster at his small deception. Where to next? Ollivander's, Hagrid said. For your wand. Every wizard needs a wand, and Ollivander makes the best in Britain. The wand shop was narrow and shabby, with thousands of narrow boxes stacked to the ceiling. A tinkling bell announced their arrival, and an old man with silvery eyes emerged from the depths of the shop. "Ah," said Mr. Ollivander softly. "Harry Potter, I was wondering when I'd be seeing you." Harry felt increasingly uncomfortable under the man's intense stare, but he remembered his mother's advice about asking questions. "You knew I'd be coming?" "Oh, yes. I remember every wand I've ever sold, Mr. Potter. It so happens that the phoenix whose tail feather is in your wand gave another feather, just one other. It is curious that you should be destined for this wand when its brother gave you that scar." Harry's hand moved instinctively to his forehead. "You mean Voldemort's wand, yes. 13.5 inches. You. Powerful wand. Very powerful. And in the wrong hands. Well, if I'd known what that wand was going out into the world to do." As Ollivander began selecting wands for Harry to try, Harry seized the opportunity to ask more questions. "Did you know my parents well? When they bought their wands?" Ollivander's eyes seemed to sharpen. "Your mother, yes. Willow, 10.25 inches, nice and supple. Excellent for charm work. She was particularly gifted with memory charms and protective enchantments, as I recall, always asking very careful questions about wand properties and magical theory." "Careful questions?" "Oh, yes. Very methodical, your mother. She wanted to understand not just how magic worked, but why. And she was always concerned about making sure her magic couldn't be traced or duplicated by others." Ollivander paused in his wand selection. "Curious thing, really. Most young witches and wizards are eager to show off their abilities. Your mother seemed more interested in keeping hers private." The locket grew warm against Harry's leg. His mother had been secretive about her magic, careful about who might be watching or tracking what she did. It was another piece of a puzzle Harry was only beginning to understand. After testing nearly a dozen wands that produced various unfortunate effects, broken windows, scattered papers, a vase that burst into flames, Harry finally found his match. The moment he held the holly wand, he felt a warm, tingling sensation spread through his fingers, and gold and red sparks shot from the tip. "Curious," Ollivander murmured. "Very curious." "What's curious?" Harry asked. "The holly wand chose you, Mr. Potter. 11 inches, nice and supple, with a phoenix feather core. Holly is a protective wood, you know. It repels evil. Fascinating that it should choose you, given your unique circumstances." As they left Ollivander's, Harry's mind was spinning with new information. His mother had been secretive about her magic, skilled in protective charms and memory magic. She'd asked careful questions and kept her abilities private. The pattern was becoming clearer. "Hagrid," Harry said as they walked back toward the leaky cauldron, "how exactly did Professor Dumbledore know to send you to get me?" Hagrid stumbled slightly. "Well, that is to say, how did he know where I was? How did he know it was time for me to get my letter?" He keeps track of these things, doesn't he?" Hagrid said, but he sounded increasingly uncomfortable, being headmaster and all. They entered the leaky cauldron, and Harry's attention was caught by fragments of conversation from nearby tables. 2 witches in the corner were speaking in low voices, but Harry's name carried across the room. Potter boy finally getting his inheritance. About time someone checked the will properly. Sealed records at the ministry. Dumbledore's been managing the account for years. Harry felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. His inheritance was being discussed by strangers, and apparently there were sealed records at something called the ministry. He glanced at Hagrid, who was determinedly studying the menu and pretending not to hear the conversations around them. Tom, the innkeeper, approached their table with a warm smile. "Harry Potter, what an honor. I remember your parents well. Lovely people they were. Your mother, especially. Sharp as a tack, that one." "You knew her?" Harry asked eagerly. "Oh, she came in here fairly regular, she did. Always asking questions, always wanting to know who could be trusted and who couldn't. Very careful about who she talked to, if you know what I mean." Tom's expression grew thoughtful. "Come to think of it, she asked me more than once about keeping information private. Wanted to know how to make sure certain conversations wouldn't get back to, well, to certain people." Harry's pulse quickened. "What kind of people?" Tom glanced around nervously, then leaned closer. "Well, I probably shouldn't say, but she was always asking about Professor Dumbledore. Wanted to know if anyone had ever mentioned him asking questions about her or your father. Seemed to think someone was keeping too close an eye on their business, if you catch my meaning." "Tom," Hagrid interrupted sharply, "perhaps we shouldn't be gossiping about the dead." Tom straightened, looking slightly abashed. "Of course, you're right. Just making conversation." But Harry had heard enough. His mother had been concerned about Dumbledore keeping too close an eye on their business. She'd been asking questions about trust and privacy. She'd been preparing for something. As they sat eating lunch, Harry noticed that Hagrid seemed increasingly agitated. The large man kept glancing around the pub nervously and changing the subject whenever Harry asked questions about his parents or Dumbledore. "Hagrid," Harry said finally, "how exactly did Professor Dumbledore ask you to come get me? I mean, did he just tell you yesterday, or—" Hagrid's face went red. "Well, that is, I've been keeping an eye on the situation for a while, haven't I?" "What situation?" "Your situation, with your relatives and all. Making sure you were safe." "So you've been watching me?" Harry asked quietly. "For how long?" Hagrid fidgeted with his massive hands. "Not watching, exactly. Just checking in. Dumbledore's orders, you understand. He wanted to make sure the Dursleys were treating you properly." The locket in Harry's pocket was practically burning now. Dumbledore had been having him watched for years, possibly his entire life. The Dursleys had been treating him terribly, and somehow Dumbledore either hadn't known or hadn't cared enough to intervene. "And were they?" Harry asked. "Treating me properly." Hagrid's silence was answer enough. As they finished their meal and prepared to return Harry to the Dursleys for the remainder of the summer, Harry's mind was racing with new questions. His mother had been suspicious of Dumbledore. She'd been skilled in protective and memory magic. She'd hidden things, prepared contingencies. And for 11 years, Dumbledore had been managing Harry's affairs while leaving him with relatives who neglected and mistreated him. "Question everything," his mother had said. "Trust carefully." Harry Potter, walking back through London with a bag full of magical supplies and a pocket full of secrets, was beginning to understand why his mother had felt the need to leave him. Warnings. Chapter 3. Privet Drive, Revelations. The house at number 4. Privet Drive had never felt more like a prison than it did on the evening of July 31st. Harry sat on his narrow bed, surrounded by his new school books and supplies, but his mind was far from thoughts of transfiguration or potions. The locket lay warm in his palm, and he found himself turning it over and over, studying its delicate engravings. The day's revelations churned in his thoughts like a storm that wouldn't break. His mother had been suspicious of Dumbledore. She'd been asking careful questions, making preparations, hiding things. The portrait had mentioned memories, and now Harry held what might be the key to understanding what his mother had discovered. As the evening grew darker, and the sounds of Uncle Vernon watching television filtered up from downstairs, Harry finally worked up the courage to examine the locket more closely. In the dim light from his desk lamp, he could see tiny runes etched around its edges, symbols that meant nothing to him, but seemed to pulse with their own faint light. Almost without thinking, he pressed his thumb to the center of the locket. The effect was immediate and overwhelming. The small room around him seemed to fade, replaced by a much different scene. He was seeing through someone else's eyes, his mother's eyes, as she sat at a kitchen table, writing frantically by lamplight. "James!" His mother's voice came, as if from a great distance. "Are you sure about this letter to Petunia?" "Lily, love, if something happens to us—" The voice must have been his father's, though Harry had never heard it before. It was warm, concerned, but tinged with fear. "She's your sister. She needs to know what to watch for." "I just hope I'm wrong about Albus," his mother replied, her quill scratching across parchment. "But the questions he's been asking, the way he looks at Harry when he thinks we're not watching. I can't shake the feeling that he sees our son as something other than a child to protect." "What are you telling her?" "The truth. That if anything happens to us, she shouldn't let Dumbledore make all the decisions about Harry's life. That there are people in our circle who can't be trusted." His mother paused in her writing. "I'm giving her names, James. People I've caught in lies. People who've asked too many questions about our whereabouts, about Harry. You really think, Peter? I don't know what to think anymore. But I'm not taking chances with our son's life." The memory faded, leaving Harry gasping on his bed, the locket cool in his trembling hand. His mother had written to Aunt Petunia. She'd given her names of people who couldn't be trusted, and somewhere in this house, Aunt Petunia had received that letter. Before he could lose his nerve, Harry crept downstairs. The television was still blaring in the living room, Uncle Vernon's snores competing with the sound. Harry found Aunt Petunia in the kitchen, mechanically wiping down surfaces that were already spotless. "Aunt Petunia," he said quietly. She jumped, dropping her cloth. When she turned to face him, her expression was wary. "What do you want? It's nearly midnight." "I need to ask you something about my mother." Petunia's face went pale. "I've told you everything I'm going to tell you about that woman." "No, you haven't." Harry took a deep breath, remembering the memory he'd just witnessed. "She wrote to you, didn't she? Before she died. She wrote you a letter." The silence that followed was deafening. Petunia's hands began to shake, and she gripped the edge of the kitchen counter. "How could you possibly know that?" she whispered. "She left me things," Harry said carefully. "Things that helped me understand what was happening before she and Dad were killed." "Please, Aunt Petunia. I need to know what she told you." Petunia stared at him for a long moment, and Harry saw something crack in her usually cold expression. When she spoke, her voice was barely audible. She was terrified. The letter, it arrived 3 weeks before the news of their deaths. She said if anything happened to her and James, I wasn't to let Albus Dumbledore make all the decisions about you. Harry's heart pounded. What else did she say? That there were people she'd trusted who had betrayed that trust. She gave me names, Harry. Names of people she said I should never, ever let near you. Petunia's voice cracked. I burned the letter. I was so angry with her for dragging me into her world again, even in death. But I remember the names. Tell me. Petunia closed her eyes. Albus Dumbledore was the first one. She said he was a great man who'd lost sight of the fact that children weren't chess pieces to be moved around for the greater good. She opened her eyes, looking directly at Harry. Peter Pettigrew was another. She said she'd caught him in lies about where he'd been, who he'd been talking to, and there was someone called Wormtail. I never knew if that was a real name or some sort of nickname. Harry felt as if the floor had dropped away beneath him. His mother had suspected Peter Pettigrew of betrayal. She'd known, somehow, that someone close to them was feeding information to their enemies. There were others, Petunia continued, her composure crumbling completely. Names I didn't recognize. But those 3, those were the ones she was most worried about. Why didn't you tell me this before? Because I was angry. The words burst out of her. Because I was jealous and bitter, and I convinced myself it was all nonsense. because it was easier to hate you than to admit that my sister had tried to protect you and I'd failed her. Vernon's voice boomed from the doorway. What the hell is going on in here? Petunia, why are you crying? Go back to bed, Vernon, Petunia said firmly. This doesn't concern you. Doesn't concern me. That freak is making my wife cry in my own kitchen. He's not a freak, Petunia snapped, startling both Harry and Vernon. He's my nephew, and his mother trusted me with information that could save his life. Information I've been too much of a coward to share. Vernon's face turned purple. I won't have this madness in my house. Then perhaps, Petunia said, with quiet steel in her voice, it's time you remembered that this is my house too, and that boy is my blood, whether we like it or not. The argument that followed was explosive. Vernon screamed about freaks and abnormality and the sanctity of their normal life. Petunia screamed back about duty and family and the sister she'd lost. Through it all, Harry sat at the kitchen table, processing what he'd learned. His mother had known. Somehow, weeks before their deaths, she'd figured out that someone close to them was a traitor. She'd tried to protect him by warning Aunt Petunia, by giving her names of people not to trust. When the shouting finally died down, and Vernon had stormed off to sleep in the guest room, Petunia sat across from Harry at the table. Her eyes were red from crying, but her expression was clearer than Harry had ever seen it. There's more, she said quietly. Things Lily told me about you specifically. What kind of things? She said you would be powerful, more powerful than either she or your father, and she said that was exactly why certain people would try to control you rather than protect you. Petunia's hands twisted in her lap. She made me promise that if she died, I would make sure you learned to ask questions, to think for yourself, to never trust anyone completely, no matter how good their intentions seemed. Harry felt the weight of his mother's planning settling on his shoulders. The portrait in the vault, the locket full of memories, the letter to Aunt Petunia, all of it designed to ensure he would learn the truth, would be prepared for whatever came next. She loved you so much, Petunia whispered. More than I ever understood until I read that letter. Everything she did, every precaution she took, it was all to keep you safe. Then why did you treat me so badly? Harry asked, the question that had burned in him for 11 years finally finding voice. Petunia was quiet for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was small and ashamed. Because every time I looked at you, I saw her. And I hated myself for not being the sister she deserved, for not being brave enough to help her when she needed me. It was easier to take it out on you than to face what I'd become. They sat in silence for several minutes, the kitchen clock ticking loudly in the stillness. Finally, Harry reached into his pocket and pulled out the locket. This has more memories in it, he said. Things she wanted me to know. But I think I need to understand how to access them properly. Petunia nodded. She mentioned that too. Said you'd need to learn about your magic before you could fully understand what she'd left you. She looked directly at him. Harry, I know I can't make up for 11 years of what we put you through. But if you need help, if there are questions you can't get answered at school, you can ask me. I may not have magic, but I was Lily Evans's sister once, before I was afraid of everything that made her special. Harry pocketed the locket, feeling its warmth against his palm. For the first time in his life, Number 4 Privet Drive felt like it might actually contain family, rather than just the people who grudgingly housed him. But more importantly, he now knew that his mother's suspicions had extended far beyond just Dumbledore. There had been betrayal within the very group that was supposed to protect his family. Someone named Peter Pettigrew, and someone called Wormtail, though whether they were the same person, he didn't yet know. As he returned to his room and lay down in his narrow bed, Harry stared at the ceiling and tried to process everything he'd learned. His parents hadn't just been killed by Voldemort, they'd been betrayed by people they'd trusted. His mother had known it was coming, and had tried to prepare for it. Question everything, she'd told him. Trust carefully. Harry Potter, lying in the darkness with his new understanding of his family's history, realized that his real education was only just beginning. Chapter 4. The Journey to Hogwarts. September first arrived with a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. Harry stood on platform 9 3/4, surrounded by the bustling crowd of witches, wizards, and magical families, feeling more isolated than he had in months. The summer at Privet Drive had been different after his conversation with Aunt Petunia. Not warm, exactly, but no longer openly hostile. She'd even packed him a proper lunch for the train journey, though she'd done it without meeting his eyes. The Hogwarts Express gleamed red in the morning sunlight, steam billowing from its chimney as students hugged their parents goodbye and hauled trunks onto the carriages. Harry touched the locket through his shirt, feeling its familiar warmth. Over the summer, he'd tried repeatedly to access more memories, but the magic seemed to require something he didn't yet understand. As he made his way down the train corridor looking for an empty compartment, Harry's mind was focused on a single goal: gather information. His mother's warnings echoed in his thoughts, along with Aunt Petunia's revelation about the names in Lily's letter. He needed to understand who could be trusted at Hogwarts, and that meant being very careful about what he revealed to anyone. He found a compartment with only one occupant, a red-haired boy about his own age who was attempting to turn his pet rat yellow with a clearly malfunctioning spell. "Oh, do you mind if I sit?" Harry asked. "Everywhere else is pretty full." The boy looked up, his face brightening. "Not at all. I'm Ron Weasley. You're Harry Potter, aren't you?" His eyes went immediately to Harry's scar. "Yeah," Harry said, settling into the seat across from Ron and carefully observing his reaction. Ron seemed genuinely excited rather than calculating, which was encouraging. "That your rat?" "This is Scabbers," Ron said, holding up the rather pathetic-looking creature. "He's been in my family for years. My brother Percy gave him to me when he got an owl." As the train pulled away from the platform, Harry decided to test the waters. "So, you're from a wizarding family, then? Must be nice, growing up knowing about magic." "Yeah, though we're not exactly what you'd call well off," Ron said, looking slightly embarrassed. "Mum and Dad do their best, but with 7 kids. Dad works at the Ministry of Magic, in the Misuse of Muggle Artifacts office. Not exactly the most prestigious department." Harry's attention sharpened. "The Ministry of Magic? That sounds important." "Well, Dad thinks it is. He's always going on about how important it is to understand Muggles, especially with you-know-who's followers still out there." Ron lowered his voice. "Dad works pretty closely with Dumbledore sometimes. Mum says Dumbledore's the greatest wizard alive, saved us all from you-know-who." The information hit Harry like a physical blow, though he kept his expression carefully neutral. Ron's father worked closely with Dumbledore. That made the Weasley family either valuable allies or potential threats, depending on how much they knew about Dumbledore's methods. "Dumbledore's the headmaster at Hogwarts, right?" Harry asked, as if he didn't know. "Yeah, and he's brilliant. Mum says we're lucky to have him looking out for the wizarding world." Ron's enthusiasm was obvious and apparently genuine. "What do you think of him? I mean, he must have been involved in keeping you safe all these years." Harry chose his words carefully. "I haven't met him yet. I guess I'll find out what he's like when we get to school." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a girl with bushy brown hair and an armload of books. "Has anyone seen a toad? A boy named Neville's lost his." "No," Ron said, "but you could try a locating charm." The girl, who introduced herself as Hermione Granger, looked skeptical. "Are you sure you know any real magic? I've read about all the spells we'll be learning, and that's not a first-year charm." Harry watched the interaction with interest. Hermione clearly knew a great deal about magic for someone who'd presumably only learned about it recently, if she was coming to Hogwarts for the first time. "How long have you known about magic?" he asked her. "Only since I got my letter," Hermione said, settling into the compartment. but I've read everything I could get my hands on since then. It's fascinating how complex magical theory is. The interplay between intent, emotion, and proper wand movement is incredibly sophisticated. Harry felt a flicker of genuine interest. Here was someone who approached magic the way his mother apparently had, with careful study and analytical thinking. "What's the most interesting thing you've learned?" Hermione's eyes lit up. "Probably the history of magical concealment. The International Statute of Wizarding Secrecy wasn't just about hiding from muggles. It was about controlling information flows within the magical community itself. Some of the most powerful families have been manipulating what information gets preserved and what gets forgotten for centuries." The word sent a chill down Harry's spine. Manipulation of information, control of what people knew and remembered. It sounded uncomfortably similar to what his mother had been worried about. "That's quite advanced reading," he said carefully. "Where did you find books about that?" "Diagon Alley, mostly, though some of the most interesting information was in older books that weren't on the Hogwarts list." Hermione pulled a volume from her bag. "This one talks about magical portraits and memory preservation. Apparently, some of the most powerful witches and wizards have used portraits to ensure certain information survives even if they don't." Harry's hand moved involuntarily toward the locket under his shirt. "That sounds useful." "Oh, it is. The book mentions that portrait magic can be triggered by specific conditions, inheritance touches, emotional states, even proximity to certain people. It's like having a conversation with someone who planned for every possible future." As the train sped through the countryside, Harry found himself increasingly impressed by both his new companions, though for very different reasons. Ron was clearly loyal and kind, but his family's connection to Dumbledore meant Harry would have to be careful about what he shared. Hermione's analytical approach to magic might make her a valuable ally, but her Muggle background meant she had no existing loyalties to navigate. Neither of them could know about the portrait or the locket, at least not yet. The boat ride across the lake to Hogwarts gave Harry his first glimpse of the castle that would be his home for the next 7 years. As he stared up at the towering spires and glowing windows, he couldn't help wondering what his mother had thought of this place. Had she felt safe here? Had she trusted the teachers who were now going to be responsible for his education? The Great Hall was everything Hagrid had promised, vast, magical, with floating candles and a ceiling that showed the night sky. But Harry found himself studying the staff table rather than marveling at the architecture. There was Professor McGonagall, stern and efficient as she organized the first years. Professor Dumbledore sat in the center, his long silver beard and twinkling eyes exactly as Hagrid had described, and at the far end of the table sat a man with black hair and a hooked nose who was staring directly at Harry with an expression that seemed familiar somehow. Not hostile, as Harry might have expected, but almost protective, as if he was evaluating threats rather than looking for faults. When McGonagall called, "Potter, Harry," the Great Hall fell silent. Harry walked to the stool and sat down, feeling hundreds of eyes on him. The sorting hat settled over his head, and for a moment he wondered if it could read minds well enough to discover his secrets. "Gryffindor!" the hat called out, and the Gryffindor table erupted in cheers. As Harry made his way to the Gryffindor table, he caught part of a quiet conversation between McGonagall and Dumbledore. "Boy seems more reserved than expected," McGonagall was saying. "Very careful, very observant. Not quite what I anticipated from the stories." Dumbledore's response was too quiet to hear, but Harry filed the observation away. Even McGonagall had expected him to be different than he was. What stories had they been telling about him? The feast passed in a blur of rich food and new faces. Harry answered questions about his scar and his fame, politely but briefly, all the while studying the adults at the staff table. Which of them could be trusted? Which of them reported everything back to Dumbledore? Back in Gryffindor Tower, Harry waited until his dorm mates were asleep before pulling out the locket. He'd been hoping that being at Hogwarts, surrounded by magic, might allow him to access more memories. This time, when he pressed his thumb to the center, the locket responded immediately. He was seeing through his mother's eyes again. But this scene was different. She was pacing in what looked like a sitting room, her face tight with worry, while his father sat in a chair nearby. "I don't understand why he won't tell us more about this prophecy," his mother was saying. "If it concerns Harry directly, don't we have a right to know what it says?" "Dumbledore says it's safer if we don't know the full details," his father replied, but he sounded uncertain. "That knowing too much might influence our decisions. Or it might help us make better ones." Lily's voice was sharp with frustration. "James, he's talking about our son, our baby, and he's making decisions based on information he won't share with us. What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking that a prophecy important enough to get us all killed is something we should understand completely." Lily stopped pacing and looked directly at James. "And I'm wondering what else Albus isn't telling us about the choices he's making on our behalf." The memory faded, leaving Harry staring into the darkness of his dormitory. A prophecy. There was a prophecy about him, something important enough that Voldemort had come after his family because of it, and Dumbledore had kept the details from his parents, had made decisions about their lives based on information he wouldn't share. Harry tucked the locket back under his shirt and lay down, his mind racing. Tomorrow, his real education would begin. Not just in magic, but in understanding the complex web of secrets and lies that seemed to surround his very existence. His mother had been right to be suspicious, and if she'd been right about that, then her warnings about the other names, Peter Pettigrew, Wormtail, were probably accurate too. As he drifted off to sleep in his four-poster bed, Harry Potter made a silent promise to his mother's memory. He would find out the truth about the prophecy, about the betrayals that had led to his parents' deaths, and about the man who claimed to be protecting him while keeping so many dangerous secrets. Question everything, she'd told him. Trust carefully. He was finally in a position to do both. Chapter 5. Lessons and Loyalties. 3 weeks into his first term at Hogwarts, Harry Potter had learned that brewing potions was remarkably similar to the careful, methodical approach his mother had recommended for everything else in life. "Clockwise stirs only, Mr. Potter," Professor Snape said as he swept past Harry's cauldron. "And precisely 3 drops of beetle eyes. Not 4. Harry nodded, adjusting his technique with the same careful attention he'd been giving to all his classes. Unlike most of his fellow Gryffindors, he'd actually read ahead in his potions textbook, studying not just the recipes, but the theory behind why certain ingredients reacted the way they did. The result was that his potions actually worked, which seemed to surprise everyone, including Professor Snape. "Adequate," Snape pronounced, examining Harry's perfect cure for boils. Around them, other students were dealing with various disasters. Neville's cauldron was melting, Seamus's potion was the wrong color entirely, and Ron was frantically trying to fish a dead beetle out of his mixture. When class ended and the other students filed out, Snape's voice stopped Harry at the door. "Mr. Potter." A word. Harry's stomach clenched, but he approached Snape's desk with what he hoped was a calm expression. Over the past few weeks, he'd been carefully observing all his teachers, trying to determine who might be trustworthy and who might report everything back to Dumbledore. "Your performance in this class has been unexpected," Snape said, his dark eyes studying Harry intently. "Most students struggle with even basic potion-making in their first year." "I read ahead," Harry said simply. "Yes, I'm sure you did. But reading and understanding are different things. Your approach to potion-making suggests someone taught you to think analytically about magic, not just memorize instructions." Snape leaned back in his chair. "Tell me about your summer, Potter." The question was casual, but something in Snape's tone made Harry's hand drift toward the locket under his shirt. Since arriving at Hogwarts, he'd noticed that the locket grew warm whenever he was near certain people or in certain situations. It had practically burned during their first defense against the dark arts class with Professor Quirrell. It was educational, Harry said carefully. I learned some things about my parents that I hadn't known before. Snape went very still. What sort of things? Harry studied Snape's face, noting the sudden tension there. The professor had been staring at him with that odd, almost protective expression since the welcome feast. Combined with the way he'd just reacted to the mention of Harry's parents, it suggested there was more to Professor Snape than his harsh classroom persona. Taking a calculated risk, Harry decided to test the waters. I found something of my mother's, something she left for me to discover. The effect on Snape was immediate and dramatic. His pale face went even whiter, and he gripped the edge of his desk with white knuckles. What did you find? I think you knew her better than most people realize, Harry said, instead of answering directly. The way you look at me, it's not just because I'm famous or because I look like my father. For a long moment, the dungeon was completely silent. Then Snape spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. Your mother was one of the most brilliant witches of her generation, and one of the most careful. Careful about what? Snape stood and moved to his office door, closing it with a wave of his wand, before casting what Harry assumed were privacy charms. When he turned back to Harry, his usual sneer was gone, replaced by something that looked almost like grief. Your mother suspected there was a spy in their group, long before anyone else did, Snape said finally. She came to me several times in the months before her death, asking questions about loyalty, about how to identify deception. She came to you? Harry was genuinely surprised. But you weren't you on the other side? It's complicated. Snape returned to his chair, suddenly looking older than his years. Your mother and I, we had history. Despite everything that had happened between us, she still trusted me enough to share her concerns when she had nowhere else to turn. What kind of concerns? She believed someone close to them was feeding information to the Dark Lord. Someone who knew their movements, their safe houses, their plans. Snape's voice turned bitter. I tried to convince her to leave, to take you and James and disappear completely. But she wouldn't abandon the fight. Harry felt the pieces of the puzzle shifting in his mind. Did you warn Dumbledore about her suspicions? Something flickered across Snape's face. I tried. But Dumbledore believed the spy was someone else entirely. He was convinced of his own assessment and unwilling to consider alternatives. And my mother didn't trust his assessment. Your mother trusted very few people by the end, Snape said quietly. She'd learned to be suspicious of anyone who claimed to be fighting for the greater good while keeping their true methods secret. The conversation was interrupted by a knock on the door. Snape quickly cast a charm to return the room to normal, before opening it to reveal Hermione Granger. I'm sorry to interrupt, Professor, she said, but Ron said Harry was still down here, and we need him for our Transfiguration study group. Of course, Snape said smoothly. Mr. Potter, we'll continue this discussion later. I believe you'll find our conversations educational. As Harry gathered his things and followed Hermione out of the dungeon, his mind was reeling. Professor Snape had known his mother personally and had been trying to help her. More importantly, Snape clearly knew more about the betrayal that had led to his parents' deaths. Harry, are you all right? Hermione asked as they climbed the stairs. You look like you've seen a ghost. Just thinking about what Professor Snape said, Harry replied. Hermione, can I ask you something? You've read a lot about magical theory. Have you come across anything about objects that react to magic? Hermione's eyes sharpened with interest. What kind of reactions? Temperature changes, when they're near certain types of magic or certain people. That sounds like protective enchantments, Hermione said immediately. Some magical objects are designed to warn their owners about potential threats. Why do you ask? Harry glanced around to make sure they weren't being overheard. Can we talk privately? There's something I need to tell you. 20 minutes later, they were tucked away in a corner of the library, surrounded by books on magical theory. Harry had made a decision. If he was going to investigate the mysteries surrounding his parents' deaths, he needed allies, and Hermione's analytical mind and research skills made her invaluable. "A portrait of your mother," Hermione whispered, her eyes wide. "In your family's Gringotts vault." "And this locket contains more memories," Harry said, pulling it out to show her. "But I can only access them sometimes, and I think I need to understand more about magic to unlock all of them." Hermione examined the locket carefully, noting the runes around its edges. "This is incredibly sophisticated magic. Memory storage, triggered activation, protective enchantments. Your mother must have been extraordinarily talented." "She was suspicious of Dumbledore," Harry said quietly, "and other people in their group. She left me warnings about who not to trust." "That's why you've been so careful about what you tell people," Hermione said, understanding dawning in her expression. "You're not sure who's safe." "Exactly. And now Professor Snape has basically confirmed that my mother was right to be suspicious. There was a spy in their group, someone close enough to know their secrets." Hermione was quiet for several minutes, processing this information. Finally, she looked up at him. "What do you need me to do?" "Help me research. Help me understand how this locket works, how to access all the memories my mother left me, and help me figure out who at this school can actually be trusted." "Of course," Hermione said without hesitation. "But Harry, if your mother was right about there being spies and betrayers, then you need to be very careful about who else you tell about this." "I know. That's why I'm only telling you." "What about Ron?" Harry hesitated. "Ron's family is loyal to Dumbledore. Until I understand more about what happened, I can't risk word getting back to the wrong people." They spent the next hour researching magical portraits and memory enchantments, with Hermione proving invaluable at finding relevant information. She discovered that portrait magic could indeed be programmed with specific triggers, and that inherited magical objects often required their owner to reach certain levels of magical understanding before they would fully activate. "It's like a magical lock," she explained. "The more you learn about magic, the more memories you'll be able to access. Your mother designed it so that you'd only get the information when you were ready to understand and act on it." When they finally left the library, they found Ron waiting for them in the common room, looking distinctly put out. "Where have you two been?" he demanded. "I've been looking everywhere for you." "Just studying," Harry said, which was technically true. "Studying what? You've been disappearing together for days now, and in potions today, you knew things that definitely weren't in our textbook." Harry exchanged a glance with Hermione. Ron's suspicion was understandable, but it also represented exactly the kind of security risk they couldn't afford. "Just extra reading," Hermione said smoothly. "Harry's been helping me understand some of the more advanced concepts." Ron didn't look entirely convinced, but he let the subject drop. As the evening progressed and they worked on their actual homework, Harry found himself watching his red-haired friend carefully. Ron was kind, loyal, and genuine, but his family's connections to Dumbledore made him a potential security risk. Later that night, as Harry lay in his four-poster bed listening to his doormate's breathing, he reflected on how much his life had changed in just a few weeks. He had an unexpected ally in Professor Snape, a research partner in Hermione, and access to his mother's memories that would hopefully provide more answers as his magical education progressed. Most importantly, he was finally in a position to investigate the truth about his parents' deaths. The knowledge that someone had betrayed them, someone they'd trusted, burned in his chest like a coal. His mother had been right to be suspicious, right to prepare contingencies, right to warn him about trusting too easily. Now it was up to him to finish what she'd started and discover who had been responsible for destroying his family. Question everything, she'd told him. Trust carefully. Harry Potter, surrounded by the quiet sounds of his sleeping classmates, was finally beginning to understand the true complexity of the game his parents had been playing, and lost. Chapter 6. The Philosopher's Stone Connection. The revelation came during what should have been a routine study session in the library. Harry, Hermione, and Ron were researching transfiguration theory when Hermione pulled out a copy of the Daily Prophet from 2 days earlier. She'd been collecting newspapers as part of her effort to understand current events in the wizarding world, and something in this particular issue had caught her attention. "Listen to this," she said quietly, leaning across the table. "Break-in at Gringotts. Vault raided on July 31st. That's your birthday, Harry." Harry's blood went cold. "What?" "The vault that was broken into. It says here it was emptied earlier that same day. The goblins won't say what was taken, but they're calling it the first successful break-in in centuries." Hermione looked up at him with sharp eyes. "That's quite a coincidence, don't you think?" Ron, who had been pointedly ignoring their whispered conversations for weeks, finally snapped. "Right, that's it. I don't know what's going on with you two, but the secretive looks and the private conversations stop now. We're supposed to be friends, aren't we?" Harry exchanged a glance with Hermione. They'd been expecting this confrontation for days. Ron's hurt feelings had been obvious, and his inclusion had become inevitable. "You're right," Harry said finally. "But what we're going to tell you, it's dangerous, Ron, and it involves your family." "My family?" "Your father works with Dumbledore," Harry said carefully. "And what we've discovered, it's about Dumbledore, about things he's done that might not be as noble as everyone believes." For the next hour, Harry and Hermione filled Ron in on everything: the portrait in the vault, the locket, memories, Lily's warnings about betrayal, Snape's revelations about the spy. Ron's expression grew increasingly troubled as the story unfolded. "You really think Dumbledore knew there was a spy and didn't do anything about it?" Ron asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I think Dumbledore makes decisions based on information he doesn't share with anyone," Harry said, "and I think my mother figured that out." "But the break-in," Hermione said, returning to the newspaper. "If it happened on your birthday, and if the vault was emptied earlier that day, Harry, what if someone was specifically trying to steal whatever was taken right after you visited Gringotts?" The implications hit Harry like a physical blow. Someone had known he would be at Gringotts on July 31st. Someone had known that the vault would be emptied that day, providing the perfect opportunity to steal its contents without anyone realizing until it was too late. "We need to find out what was in that vault," Harry said. It was Ron who made the connection. "You know what? I bet it was the same thing that's hidden on the 3rd floor. That thing Fluffy's guarding." Harry stared at him. "How do you know about that?" "Everyone knows about it," Ron said impatiently. "Well, everyone who's been paying attention. There's something hidden at Hogwarts, something important enough that they brought in a 3-headed dog to guard it. And if you ask me, Professor Dumbledore is using it as bait." "Bait for what?" "For whoever tried to steal it from Gringotts," Hermione said, understanding dawning in her eyes. "He moved it here because he wanted the thief to come after it again." "But why?" That night, alone in his dormitory, Harry activated the locket with a growing sense of dread. The memory that appeared was more recent than the others. Lily looked older, more tired, and deeply worried. "James, I'm starting to think Albus sees all of us as pieces on a chessboard," she was saying. "Pieces he can move around and sacrifice as needed for his vision of the greater good." "Lily, that's a serious accusation." "Is it wrong, though?" Lily's voice was sharp with frustration. "Look at how he's handled the prophecy situation. He knows more than he's telling us. He's making plans he won't share, and he expects us to trust him completely while he trusts us with nothing. He's trying to protect us." "He's trying to control the outcome," Lily corrected. "And the difference matters, James. Protecting us would mean giving us all the information we need to make our own choices. Control means manipulating circumstances so that we make the choices he wants us to make." The memory shifted, showing Lily alone, writing in what looked like a journal. "If something happens to me," she said aloud, apparently speaking to the journal itself, "I need Harry to understand this. Albus Dumbledore is a good man who has convinced himself that other people's lives are his to spend in service of what he believes is right. He will present it as necessary sacrifice, as the only way to achieve victory. But there is always another choice, Harry. Always. Don't let anyone convince you that their vision of the greater good is worth more than the individual lives they're asking you to sacrifice. The memory faded, leaving Harry shaking on his bed. The next morning, he sought out Professor Snape after potions class. The conversation about Dumbledore's methods was one he needed to have with someone who had known his mother. "Professor," Harry said once the classroom was empty, "my mother mentioned something about Dumbledore and the greater good. Did she ever talk to you about that?" Snape's expression darkened. "Your mother was one of the few people who recognized Dumbledore's fundamental flaw. He genuinely believes that he can calculate the value of individual lives against the potential benefit to the wizarding world as a whole. And you think she was right to be concerned about that?" "I think," Snape said carefully, "that Dumbledore knew who the spy was months before your parents died, and I think he allowed the situation to continue because he believed it would ultimately serve his purposes." Harry felt sick. "He let my parents be betrayed? He let events proceed according to his calculations," Snape corrected. "Whether that constitutes betrayal depends on whether you believe the headmaster had the right to make that choice." The conversation was interrupted by Harry's first Quidditch match that afternoon. As he flew through the air chasing the golden snitch, Harry felt the familiar warmth of the locket against his chest. But during the match, the warmth became almost unbearable heat. Looking down at the stands, Harry saw Professor Quirrell staring up at him with an expression of intense concentration. His scar began to burn with a pain he remembered from his earliest childhood, and Harry nearly fell off his broom. By the time he regained control, both the pain and the heat from the locket had subsided, but the message was clear. Professor Quirrell was more than he appeared to be. After the match, which Gryffindor won when Harry caught the snitch despite his distraction, Harry was approached by Professor McGonagall. "Mr. Potter," she said, her expression concerned. "Could I have a word?" They walked in silence to her office, where McGonagall closed the door and turned to face him with troubled eyes. "I've been observing you since the start of term," she said without preamble. "You're not quite what I expected." "What did you expect?" "A child who had been protected, perhaps even sheltered. Instead, I see someone who watches everyone carefully, who trusts slowly, who seems to be carrying burdens that no 11-year-old should bear." McGonagall sat behind her desk. "Harry, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. Are you happy with your home situation?" The question caught Harry off guard. "My home situation?" "The Dursleys. I had concerns about placing you with them. I expressed those concerns to Professor Dumbledore 11 years ago, but he overruled my objections." Harry studied McGonagall's face, seeing genuine worry there. "What kind of concerns?" "I watched them for a full day before we left you on their doorstep. They were the worst sort of muggles, narrow-minded, prejudiced, and cruel to anything they considered abnormal." McGonagall's voice was tight with suppressed emotion. "I told Albus that they would never love you, never understand you, never give you the childhood you deserved. He said it was necessary. Necessary for what? He wouldn't say. Only that your protection required you to be with your mother's blood relatives, regardless of their shortcomings." McGonagall leaned forward. "Harry, if they've mistreated you, if they've hurt you in any way, you can tell me. There are other options now that you're at Hogwarts." Harry felt a strange mixture of gratitude and sadness. McGonagall had tried to protect him 11 years ago, but Dumbledore had overruled her, just as he'd overruled Harry's parents' right to know about the prophecy. "They weren't kind," Harry said carefully, "but I survived." "You shouldn't have had to merely survive," McGonagall said fiercely. "You should have been loved, cherished, given every advantage. Instead, Albus left you with people who made you feel unwanted in your own home. As Harry returned to Gryffindor Tower that evening, his mind was spinning with new connections. Dumbledore had known about the spy, but allowed events to proceed. He'd placed Harry with abusive relatives, despite McGonagall's objections. He'd moved whatever was stolen from Gringotts to Hogwarts as bait, apparently expecting someone to try to steal it again. The pattern was becoming clear. Dumbledore orchestrated events to achieve outcomes he desired, regardless of the cost to individual people. Harry's parents, Harry himself, even the professors at Hogwarts were all pieces on his chessboard. But there was something else, something that made Harry's scar ache whenever he thought about it. Professor Quirrell's behavior during the Quidditch match, the way the locket had reacted to him, the pain in Harry's scar, it all suggested that the threat to whatever was hidden at Hogwarts was closer than anyone realized. That night, as Harry lay in his four-poster bed, listening to Ron's snores and Neville's restless mumbling, he stared at the ceiling and tried to process everything he'd learned. His mother had been right about Dumbledore's willingness to sacrifice individuals for his vision of the greater good. Snape had confirmed that Dumbledore operated through manipulation rather than protection. McGonagall had revealed that she'd been kept in the dark about many of Dumbledore's decisions. Most troubling of all, Harry was beginning to suspect that whatever was happening at Hogwarts, the hidden object, the three-headed dog, Professor Quirrell's suspicious behavior, was all part of another of Dumbledore's elaborate manipulations. The question was whether Harry was meant to be a player in this game or simply another piece to be sacrificed when the time was right. His mother's voice echoed in his memory. There is always another choice, Harry. Always. Harry Potter, lying in the darkness of his dormitory, was beginning to understand that making those choices would require him to question everything he'd been told about good and evil, protection and sacrifice, and the man who claimed to be fighting for the wizarding world's future. The real test wasn't going to be facing Voldemort. It was going to be facing the uncomfortable truth about the people who were supposed to be protecting him. Chapter 7. Allies and Enemies Revealed. The letter arrived during the first snowfall of November, delivered by a jet-black raven that landed directly on Professor Snape's desk during Harry's private potions lesson. Interesting, Snape murmured, examining the official ministry seal. It seems someone has been asking the right questions. Harry looked up from his perfectly brewed shrinking solution. Over the past few weeks, these private lessons had become a routine, officially to help Harry catch up on advanced theory, but actually to continue their investigation into his parents' deaths and Dumbledore's role in the events that followed. "What is it?" Harry asked. Snape read the letter carefully before meeting Harry's eyes. "Remember when I told you that your mother had contacted others with her suspicions? It appears one of those others has been conducting her own investigation." He folded the letter. "Amelia Bones, head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, will be conducting a routine inspection of Hogwarts tomorrow. She's specifically requested to speak with you." Harry's pulse quickened. "She knew my mother. According to this, your mother reached out to her 3 weeks before her death with what she called evidence of systematic infiltration within the resistance movement." Snape's expression was grim. "Ms. Bones has apparently been quietly investigating irregularities in your case ever since." That evening, Harry activated the locket in the privacy of his dormitory, hoping for more insight into his mother's preparations. The memory that appeared was clearer than the others. Lily sitting across from a stern-faced woman with greying hair and intelligent eyes. "Amelia, I need you to promise me something," Lily was saying. "If anything happens to James and me, you'll look into Harry's placement. Make sure he's actually safe, not just hidden away." The woman, Amelia Bones, leaned forward. "Lily, what aren't you telling me?" "I think someone very high up in our organization is making decisions that prioritize abstract goals over individual lives, including children's lives." Lily's voice was tight with worry. "I've prepared evidence packages for people I trust. If something happens to me, those packages will help you understand what I've discovered. Evidence of what? Manipulation, information control. Decisions made without consulting the people most affected by them. Lily pulled out a thick envelope. This contains copies of meeting notes, correspondence, and my own observations about patterns I've noticed. Amelia, I think someone is orchestrating events rather than just responding to them. You're talking about Dumbledore. I'm talking about someone who has convinced himself that his vision of victory justifies treating other people as expendable resources. Lily handed over the envelope. Promise me you'll investigate if something happens. Promise me you'll make sure Harry grows up knowing the truth. The memory faded, leaving Harry with a deep understanding of how thoroughly his mother had prepared for the worst-case scenario. The next morning, Amelia Bones arrived at Hogwarts with an official inspection team, but her real purpose became clear when she requested a private meeting with Harry, Snape, and, to Harry's surprise, Professor McGonagall. They gathered in McGonagall's office, with privacy charms ensuring their conversation couldn't be overheard. Bones was exactly as Harry had seen in the Locket memory, stern, intelligent, and radiating the kind of authority that came from years of investigating serious crimes. "Mr. Potter," she said without preamble, "your mother was one of the most methodical people I've ever known. When she contacted me with concerns about your safety and the circumstances surrounding your family's situation, I took those concerns seriously." "What did she tell you?" Harry asked. "That someone, in a position of authority, was making decisions about your life without consulting the people who should have had input, namely, your parents themselves." Bones pulled out a file. She gave me detailed information about irregularities she'd observed, patterns of information control, and her suspicions about how the war was being managed. Professor McGonagall leaned forward. "What kind of irregularities?" "Ministry files that have been sealed without proper justification, or investigations that were curtailed or redirected, legal proceedings that were bypassed entirely." Bones opened the file. "For example, did any of you know that Sirius Black never received a trial?" The silence that followed was deafening. "What do you mean, no trial?" McGonagall demanded. "I mean he was arrested, questioned under Veritaserum by a single aura, and sent directly to Azkaban without any formal legal proceedings. The order came from the highest levels of the Ministry, with Dumbledore's personal recommendation." Harry felt as if the floor had disappeared beneath him. "But why would Dumbledore want to skip a trial?" "That's the question I've been investigating for 11 years, Bones said grimly. "And the deeper I dig, the more irregularities I find. Your guardianship placement, for instance, was processed without the usual family assessments. The Auror investigation of your parents' deaths was concluded unusually quickly. Evidence from the scene was removed before the full forensic team could examine it." "What kind of evidence?" Snape asked sharply. Before Bones could answer, the office door burst open. Hagrid stood in the doorway, his face flushed and his eyes wide with panic. "Professor McGonagall, I need to speak with you about—" "Oh." He stopped dead, seeing the assembled group. "I didn't know you had company." "Hagrid," McGonagall said carefully, "this is Amelia Bones from the Ministry. We were just discussing some historical questions about Harry's parents." Hagrid's face went pale. "Historical questions?" "About the night they died," Bones said, studying Hagrid's reaction carefully. "Specifically about the evidence that was collected from the scene." Hagrid looked like he was going to be sick. That is, Professor Dumbledore said it was for the best." "What was for the best, Hagrid?" Harry asked quietly. "He asked me to go to Godric's Hollow that night," Hagrid said, his voice barely above a whisper. "After the Aurors had finished their initial examination. He said there were things there that would be too dangerous to leave lying around. Things that might be misunderstood." "What kind of things?" Bones demanded. "Papers. Letters. A journal your mum kept." Hagrid couldn't meet Harry's eyes. Dumbledore said it was important to make sure they didn't fall into the wrong hands, that they might compromise other people's safety. Harry felt a surge of anger so intense that the locket under his shirt grew almost burning hot. "You destroyed evidence from my parents' murder scene?" "Not destroyed," Hagrid protested. "Just moved. Dumbledore has them somewhere safe." "Hagrid," McGonagall said, her voice deadly quiet. "Are you telling me that you removed potential evidence from an active crime scene on Dumbledore's orders?" "It wasn't like that. Dumbledore said the Aurors had gotten everything important, and these were just personal things that might cause more pain if they became public." Bones was taking notes with a quill that was writing furiously on its own. "This is exactly the kind of irregular procedure your mother was concerned about, Mr. Potter. Evidence removed, files sealed, legal proceedings bypassed, all in the name of protecting people who never asked for that protection." The conversation was interrupted by a soft knock on the door. Professor Flitwick peered around the edge, looking nervous. "Minerva, I'm terribly sorry to interrupt, but I couldn't help overhearing raised voices. Is everything all right?" McGonagall looked around the room, clearly making a decision. "Phileas, please come in. Close the door behind you." As Flitwick entered and took in the serious faces around the room, his expression grew concerned. "What's happened?" "We're discussing the circumstances surrounding the Potter family's deaths," Bones explained, "and the irregularities in how the case was handled." Flitwick's face went very still. "I see." He looked directly at Harry. "Mr. Potter, I wonder if I might have a word with you privately. There are some things I believe you should know." 10 minutes later, they had moved to Flitwick's office, where the charms professor had cast every privacy charm Harry had ever heard of, and several he hadn't. "Your mother came to see me 2 weeks before she died," Flitwick said without preamble. "She asked me to promise that if anything happened to her and your father, I would watch over you, not just as a teacher, but as someone who understood what she had been trying to accomplish." What was she trying to accomplish? She was building a network of people who could be trusted to put your welfare ahead of any larger strategic concerns. Flitwick pulled out a small wrapped package. "She left this with me, with instructions to give it to you only if she died, and only after you had begun to understand the truth about what happened." Harry unwrapped the package to reveal a small, leather-bound journal. Opening it, he found page after page of his mother's careful handwriting. Observations about meetings she'd attended, conversations she'd overheard, decisions that had been made without consulting the people affected by them. "She documented everything," Flitwick said quietly. "Every time information was withheld, every time someone's welfare was sacrificed for strategic advantage, every time Dumbledore made unilateral decisions about other people's lives." Harry flipped through the pages, seeing names, dates, and detailed accounts of what his mother had perceived as a systematic pattern of manipulation and control. "She loved Albus," Flitwick continued, "but she recognized that love and trust were different things, and she stopped trusting him long before she died." When Harry returned to McGonagall's office an hour later, he found the adults deep in conversation about next steps. Bones had filled several pages with notes about irregularities in his case. Snape was cataloguing what he knew about the spy situation, and McGonagall was looking increasingly horrified at the scope of what was being revealed. "The question now," Bones was saying, "is what we do with this information. The Potter case was officially closed 11 years ago. Reopening it would require significant evidence of wrongdoing." "I think I can provide that," Harry said, holding up his mother's journal. "She documented everything." As the adults examined Lily's journal, passing it between them with expressions of growing dismay, Harry realized that the conversation had fundamentally changed. This was no longer just about understanding what had happened to his parents. This was about exposing a systematic cover-up that had been maintained for over a decade. "There's something else," Bones said finally. "Something I didn't want to mention until I was sure you could handle it, Mr. Potter. Your mother's evidence packages included a list of people she believed were involved in the betrayal of your family. The name at the top of that list wasn't Peter Pettigrew or this Wormtail person. Who was it? Bones met his eyes steadily. Albus Dumbledore himself. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of snow hitting the windows. Harry felt the weight of his mother's planning settling on his shoulders like a cloak. She hadn't just suspected that Dumbledore was manipulative. She had suspected that he was directly involved in the events that led to her death. She thought Dumbledore betrayed them, McGonagall whispered. She thought Dumbledore orchestrated events to achieve an outcome he desired, regardless of who got hurt in the process, Bones corrected. Whether that constitutes betrayal or just callous manipulation is a matter of perspective. Harry looked around the room at the faces of the adults who were supposed to protect him. Snape, grim but unsurprised. McGonagall, horrified but clearly beginning to see patterns she'd previously ignored. Flitwick, sad but resolved. Hagrid, devastated by the implications of his own actions. And Bones, professionally determined to uncover the truth regardless of how painful it might be. For the first time since discovering his mother's portrait, Harry felt like he wasn't facing this alone. "What do we do now?" he asked. "Now," Bones said. "We gather evidence, we document everything, and we prepare to hold some very powerful people accountable for what they've done." Harry nodded, thinking of his mother's words about there always being another choice. The choice now was whether to allow Dumbledore's version of events to stand unchallenged or to fight for the truth, regardless of how difficult that fight might be. Looking around at the faces of his unexpected allies, Harry Potter made his decision. Then let's get started. Chapter 8. The confrontation builds. The package arrived on Harry's bed on December 23rd, wrapped in brown paper with no return address. Inside, beneath layers of silvery fabric that seemed to flow like water, was a note written in handwriting Harry didn't recognize. "Your father left this in my possession before he died. Use it well. A friend." Harry lifted the fabric and gasped as his hands seemed to disappear beneath it. An invisibility cloak. His father's invisibility cloak. "Blimey," Ron whispered from the next bed. "That's a real invisibility cloak. Those are incredibly rare." "And incredibly useful," Hermione added, having been summoned by their excited whispers. "Especially considering what we've been planning." Over the past few weeks, since the revelations in McGonagall's office, Harry's world had transformed into something resembling a war council. Amelia Bones had officially opened an investigation into irregularities in the Potter case, citing new evidence of procedural violations and potential obstruction of justice. Professor Snape had been providing Harry with advanced protective charms for academic enrichment, while Professor Flitwick had been teaching him detection spells to better understand magical theory. Professor McGonagall, meanwhile, had been finding increasingly creative reasons to keep Dumbledore occupied with administrative matters, giving the investigation team time to work without his oversight. But tonight, Harry had finally accessed the last memory in his mother's locket. The memory was different from the others, clearer, more recent, and filled with an urgency that made Harry's chest tight with emotion. His mother was sitting alone in what looked like a small, windowless room, speaking directly to the locket itself. "Harry," she said, her green eyes fixed on the camera as if she could see through time to her son. "If you're seeing this, then the worst has happened, and I need you to know everything." She took a deep breath before continuing. "Peter Pettigrew is the traitor. I'm certain of it now. James refuses to believe it, because Peter is one of his closest friends. But I've caught him in too many lies, noticed too many coincidences. He knows things he shouldn't know, and is always conveniently absent when something goes wrong." Harry's hands clenched into fists. Peter Pettigrew, the name his mother had warned Aunt Petunia about, the name that had been bothering him for months. "But Peter isn't working alone," Lily continued. "Someone with authority is coordinating with him. Someone who has access to information about our movements and plans. Someone who can ensure that investigations go in the right direction and evidence disappears when it's inconvenient. The image of his mother paused, and Harry could see tears in her eyes. Albus Dumbledore believes that individual lives are acceptable sacrifices for what he calls the greater good. He's convinced himself that letting James and me die will somehow serve a larger purpose. I've seen the way he looks at you, Harry, not as a child to be protected, but as a tool to be shaped for some future use. Harry's vision blurred, but he forced himself to keep watching. I've hidden evidence packages in several locations. There's a secondary vault at Gringotts, Vault 713, that contains everything I've discovered about the betrayals and cover-ups. The key is... The memory flickered, and when it stabilized, his mother was holding up a small, complex-looking key, hidden where only you would think to look for it. The memory began to fade, but Lily's final words echoed clearly. Whatever happens, remember that you have choices, Harry. Don't let anyone, not Dumbledore, not prophecies, not destiny itself, convince you that you don't have the right to choose your own path. When the memory ended, Harry sat in the darkness of his dormitory, processing what he'd learned. His mother had known. She'd known who was betraying them. She'd known Dumbledore was involved, and she'd prepared one final evidence cache that could expose everything. But Vault 713, Harry remembered that number. That was the vault that had been robbed on his birthday, the one Hagrid had visited earlier that day. Someone had already gotten to his mother's evidence. The next morning, Harry shared this revelation with his core group of allies. They met in an unused classroom, with Professor Flitwick maintaining privacy charms and Professor McGonagall standing guard. Vault 713 was where they moved the Philosopher's Stone, Hermione said immediately. If your mother hid evidence there, then whoever stole the stone also got the evidence, Harry finished. But why would they want both? Because, Professor Snape said from the doorway, having just arrived, the same person orchestrated both situations. The stone was moved to Hogwarts as bait, and your mother's evidence was a bonus prize for whoever took it. You think Dumbledore arranged for the evidence to be stolen? I think Dumbledore has been playing a very long game, Snape replied, and we've been playing right into his hands. That evening, Harry, Ron, and Hermione put the invisibility cloak to its first real test. They'd been planning to investigate Professor Quirrell's suspicious behavior for weeks, but the cloak finally made it possible. They followed Quirrell from the Great Hall after dinner, watching as he made his way not to his office, but to a series of increasingly restricted areas of the castle. What they overheard when Quirrell stopped in an empty corridor made Harry's blood run cold. "Master," Quirrell whispered to seemingly empty air, "the protections around the stone are formidable, but not impossible. However, the boy's investigation is proceeding faster than anticipated." A high, cold voice seemed to respond, though Harry couldn't make out the words clearly. "Yes, Master. Potter has allies now, adults who are asking dangerous questions. If they discover the truth about the night his parents died..." Again, the response was too quiet to hear, but Quirrell's next words were unmistakable. "Of course, Master. Let them come. The boy walking into our trap will serve our purposes perfectly." Under the cloak, Harry exchanged horrified looks with his friends. Quirrell was definitely possessed by Voldemort, and they were walking into a trap. But more than that, the conversation suggested that Voldemort and his allies knew about Harry's investigation and were counting on it to achieve their goals. When they returned to Gryffindor Tower, they found Neville Longbottom waiting for them, looking unusually determined. "I know what you three have been doing," he said quietly, "and I want to help." "Neville, this isn't a game," Harry began. "I know it's not a game," Neville interrupted, his voice stronger than Harry had ever heard it. "My parents were tortured into insanity by Death Eaters who were never properly prosecuted. My grandmother has been telling me for years that there were people in authority who let that happen because it was politically convenient. Harry stared at him. Your grandmother distrusted Dumbledore too? She never said his name directly, but she always told me to be careful of people who make grand speeches about sacrifice while never sacrificing anything themselves. Neville's jaw was set with determination. If you're fighting against the people who destroyed our families, then I'm fighting with you. The next day, their planning became more serious. Hermione had been studying the defensive spells that Professors Snape and Flitwick had been teaching Harry, preparing magical protections that first-year students technically shouldn't know. Ron had approached his twin brothers, who agreed to help despite their father's loyalty to Dumbledore. Dad's always trusted Dumbledore completely, Fred said during a clandestine meeting in an unused classroom. But George and I have always wondered why Harry Potter was left with relatives who obviously hated him. If Dumbledore really had Harry's best interests at heart, George added, he would have checked on him over the years, wouldn't he? Meanwhile, Professor Bones had been coordinating with the adult allies, gathering evidence, and preparing for what everyone knew was coming: a direct confrontation with Dumbledore about his role in the cover-up of the Potter murders and his manipulation of current events. That night, Harry wrote a series of letters, one to each of his allies, explaining everything he knew and asking them to continue the investigation if something happened to him. The letters were to be delivered by Owl only if he failed to check in by a certain time. You really think we're going to need those? Ron asked, as Harry sealed the last envelope. I think my mother was right about being prepared for every possibility, Harry replied, and I think we're about to walk into something that Dumbledore has been planning for months, maybe years. Then why are we doing it? Harry looked around at his friends. Ron, loyal and brave despite his fears. Hermione, brilliant and determined to see justice done. Neville, quiet but resolute in his demand for truth about what had happened to their families. Behind them, he could feel the presence of his adult allies. Snape, McGonagall, Flitwick, and Bones, all risking their careers and reputations to expose the truth. Because my mother was also right about having choices, Harry said finally. Dumbledore is counting on us to react predictably, to do exactly what he expects us to do. But we don't have to play his game by his rules. What are you thinking? Hermione asked. Harry pulled out the locket, feeling its familiar warmth. I'm thinking that if Quirrell and Voldemort want us to come after the stone, then they're expecting us to fail in a specific way, which means we need to succeed in a way they're not prepared for. And how do we do that? By remembering that this isn't just about stopping Voldemort from getting the stone, Harry said. It's about exposing the truth about what Dumbledore has been doing, about making sure that whatever happens down there, the evidence of his manipulations comes to light. The next morning was Christmas Eve. Around them, the castle was decorated for the holidays, and most students were either heading home for Christmas or preparing for festive celebrations. But Harry and his allies were preparing for something very different. They were preparing to confront not just the Dark Lord who had killed Harry's parents, but the man who had orchestrated the circumstances that allowed it to happen. The game was finally moving toward its endgame, and Harry Potter was determined that this time the pieces on the board would choose their own moves. Tomorrow night, he said to his assembled friends and allies, we end this. Whether they were walking into victory or disaster, Harry wasn't sure. But he was certain of one thing. They would face it together, and they would face it with their eyes open to the truth about all the players in this deadly game. His mother had given him the tools he needed. Now it was time to use them. Chapter 9. The Philosopher's Stone. Gambit. Christmas night at Hogwarts was supposed to be peaceful. Instead, Harry Potter found himself standing at the entrance to the forbidden third-floor corridor, surrounded by his allies, and feeling the weight of his mother's locket burning against his chest. The protective charm she'd woven into it was reacting to the dark magic ahead of them. Everyone remember the plan, Harry whispered to his expanded group. Ron and Hermione flanked him, while Neville stood behind them with Fred and George Weasley. Each of them carried protective amulets that Professor Flitwick had helped them create, and Hermione had spent the past week researching every obstacle they might encounter. "Fluffy first," Hermione murmured, pulling out a small harp that Flitwick had enchanted to play itself. "Then the Devil's Snare. I've got the fire spell ready. The keys should be manageable if we work together, instead of trying to catch just one." As they opened the door and faced the massive three-headed dog, Harry couldn't help but think how different this was from the desperate, unprepared dash that Dumbledore had probably expected. They weren't rushing in blindly to save the stone. They were deliberately entering what they knew was a trap, but on their own terms and with their own backup plan. The harp's melody filled the air, and Fluffy's massive eyelids began to droop. Within minutes, the beast was snoring peacefully, and they were able to slip past into the chamber below. The Devil's Snare recoiled from Hermione's carefully controlled flame spell, allowing them to drop safely to the next level. The room with the flying keys proved easier than expected when the Weasley twins, both excellent Quidditch players, worked together to corner the correct key while Harry caught it. "You know," Fred said, as they passed through the giant chess set that Ron navigated with impressive skill, "this is all rather convenient, isn't it?" "What do you mean?" Harry asked. "I mean, obstacles that happen to match the specific skills of a first-year Gryffindor student," George replied, almost like someone designed them knowing exactly who would be coming through. Harry felt a chill that had nothing to do with the dungeon temperature. Even the obstacles had been part of Dumbledore's manipulation, designed to test Harry rather than genuinely protect the stone. When they finally reached the chamber with the Mirror of Erist, they found Quirrell waiting for them, but not alone. Voldemort's high, cold voice was clearly audible now, no longer the whispered presence Harry had overheard in corridors. "Ah, young Potter," Voldemort said through Quirrell's mouth, though Quirrell's own terrified eyes remained visible. "Right on schedule. Though I confess, I didn't expect you to bring quite so many friends." "We know you're Voldemort," Harry said, standing his ground while his friends spread out around the chamber as they'd planned, "and we know this whole thing has been a setup." "Oh, very good," Voldemort hissed with amusement. "You've been learning things, haven't you? Tell me, what exactly do you think you know?" "I know that Dumbledore moved the stone here as bait," Harry said. "I know he wanted you to come after it, and I know he expected me to face you alone." "Correct on all counts." Quirrell's face twisted with Voldemort's smile. "But do you know why? Because he thinks he can control the outcome. Because he thinks he can manipulate everyone, you, me, my friends, into doing exactly what serves his purposes." "Ah, but that's where you're wrong, Harry Potter." Voldemort's voice grew colder. "Dumbledore and I have an understanding. We have had such understandings before." Harry felt his blood turn to ice. "What kind of understanding?" "The kind where he allows certain events to proceed because they serve his greater vision. The night your parents died, for instance. He knew where they were hiding. He knew who would betray them. And he allowed it to happen because your mother's death would create something he needed." "That's a lie, is it? Tell me, boy, who suggested the Fidelius charm for your parents' protection? Who recommended they trust Peter Pettigrew as their secret keeper? Who ensured that the one person who might have saved them, Severus Snape, arrived just minutes too late?" Harry's scar began to burn, but not with pain, with rage. Behind him, he heard Neville's sharp intake of breath, and the Weasley twins muttered curses. "Even now," Voldemort continued, "he expects you to do exactly what he planned. He expects you to face me, to be marked by this encounter in ways that will make you useful for his future purposes. He expects your friends to be appropriately traumatized, appropriately grateful for his eventual rescue." "Then he's going to be disappointed," Harry said, pulling out his mother's locket. Because we didn't come here to play his game. Voldemort's laughter was high and cold. And what exactly do you think you can do against the Dark Lord Voldemort, child? Harry pressed the locket, and his mother's protective charm activated with a burst of golden light that filled the chamber. Voldemort's scream of rage and pain echoed off the stone walls as the light surrounded Harry like armor. Lily's magic, Voldemort snarled. I should have expected she would find a way to protect you, even from beyond the grave. She protected all of us, Hermione said firmly, raising her wand alongside the others. Around Harry, his friends formed a circle, their own protective charms creating a network of light that connected them all. Because that's what real protection looks like. Not manipulation, not sacrifice, but people choosing to stand together. The battle that followed was unlike anything Harry had imagined. Voldemort's possession of Quirrell made him dangerous, but the protective network his mother's magic had created around Harry's allies made them nearly impossible to touch with dark magic. Every spell Voldemort cast was turned aside or weakened by the combined light of their shields. Impossible, Voldemort hissed, as his killing curse dissipated harmlessly against Harry's golden protection. You're only children, first-year students. We're children who've been taught by people who actually care about protecting us, Harry replied. Not using us. Quirrell's body began to convulse as Voldemort fought to maintain control. The possession was breaking down under the sustained assault of Lily's protective magic, and Quirrell himself was being torn apart by the conflict. Master! Quirrell gasped with his own voice. I cannot... The pain! Hold on, Voldemort commanded. The boy cannot maintain this protection indefinitely. But at that moment, the chamber doors burst open, and Professor Snape entered, followed by Aura Bones and a team of Ministry officials. Harry had never been so relieved to see anyone in his life. It's over, Quirrell, Snape said quietly. Release your hold on him. You're too late, Severus, Voldemort hissed. The damage is done. The boy has learned what he needed to learn. The only thing we've learned, Harry said, his mother's protection still shining around him, is that you and Dumbledore deserve each other. Voldemort's fury at being compared to Dumbledore caused him to lose control completely. The dark spirit tore free from Quirrell's body in a shriek of rage, leaving the defense professor collapsed, but alive on the stone floor. As the auras secured Quirrell and began administering medical aid, Harry turned to Amelia Bones. Did you get everything? Every word, she confirmed, showing him a magical recording device. Lord Voldemort's admission that he and Dumbledore had previous understandings. His claim that Dumbledore knew about the betrayal of your parents and allowed it to happen. His statement that this entire situation was orchestrated for Dumbledore's purposes. It won't hold up in court as the testimony of a reliable witness, Snape warned. No, Bones agreed, but it corroborates all the evidence we've already gathered, and Quirrell may be willing to provide additional testimony now that he's free of possession. The moment was interrupted by the arrival of Professor Dumbledore himself, flanked by Professor McGonagall, who looked grimmer than Harry had ever seen her. Harry, my boy, Dumbledore said, his blue eyes twinkling as if nothing unusual had happened. I'm so relieved to find you safe. Though I confess I'm surprised to find so many irregularities in what should have been a straightforward rescue. There's nothing irregular about it, Harry said firmly, his mother's protection still glowing faintly around him. We came here knowing it was a trap. We came here knowing you expected me to face Voldemort alone. And we came here to gather evidence of your manipulation. Dumbledore's expression shifted slightly, the grandfatherly warmth replaced by something harder and more calculating. Evidence of what, exactly? Evidence that you've been orchestrating events for years, Amelia Bones said, stepping forward with official authority. "Evidence that you knew about the betrayal of the Potter family and allowed it to proceed. Evidence that you've manipulated Harry's placement, his care, and now his education for your own purposes. Albus Dumbledore," she continued formally, "you are under arrest for obstruction of justice, child endangerment, and conspiracy in connection with the murders of James and Lily Potter." The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of magical restraints clicking into place around Dumbledore's wrists. "This is quite unnecessary," Dumbledore said calmly. "I have acted only in Harry's best interests and in service of the greater good." "The greater good," Harry repeated, his mother's words echoing in his memory. "You know what my mother thought about your greater good, Professor? She thought it was an excuse used by people who wanted to control other people's lives without taking responsibility for the damage they caused." "Your mother was a remarkable woman," Dumbledore said softly, "but she didn't understand the larger picture." "She understood enough to protect me from you," Harry replied. "She understood enough to leave me everything I needed to see through your manipulations." As the auras led Dumbledore away, Harry looked around the chamber at his friends and allies. Quirrell was being taken to St. Mungo's for treatment. The Philosopher's Stone had been secured by the Ministry, and the evidence against Dumbledore was finally being presented to proper authorities. "Is it over?" Ron asked quietly. "This part is," Harry said, finally allowing his mother's protective charm to fade. "But I think there's still a lot of work to do." "The evidence vault at Gringotts," Hermione reminded him. "Whatever your mother hid there, we still need to recover it." "Already in progress," Bones assured them. "We'll have a full investigation of everything your mother prepared. Every piece of evidence, every protection, every plan she made to ensure the truth would come to light." As they finally left the dungeons and climbed back toward the warmth of Gryffindor Tower, Harry felt something he hadn't experienced in months, a sense of completion. His mother's final gambit had succeeded. The truth was finally coming to light. But as they walked through the corridors of Hogwarts, Harry couldn't shake the feeling that this victory was only the beginning. Dumbledore's arrest would send shockwaves through the wizarding world, and there were still questions that needed answers. What had happened to Peter Pettigrew? Who else had been involved in the conspiracy? And what would happen to the wizarding world now that one of its most powerful leaders had been exposed as a manipulator? "Harry," Neville said quietly as they reached the portrait hole. "Thank you for letting me be part of this, for helping to get answers about what really happened to our families." "Thank you for believing us," Harry replied, "for being willing to question the people everyone else trusted without question." As they settled into the empty common room, Harry touched the locket one final time. He could feel his mother's presence in it still, her love and protection and strategic planning that had made this victory possible. "There is always another choice," he whispered, repeating her words. "Always." And for the first time since arriving at Hogwarts, Harry Potter felt like he was finally free to make his own choices about his future. Chapter 10. The Truth Unveiled. The evidence vault at Gringotts was opened 3 days after Dumbledore's arrest, in the presence of a full team of Aurors, Ministry officials, and members of the Wizengamot. Harry stood beside Amelia Bones as the Goblin Keykeeper unsealed the secondary vault his mother had created, his heart pounding with anticipation and dread. What they found inside was devastating in its thoroughness. Lily Potter had documented everything, box after box of carefully organized evidence, transcripts of order meetings, copies of correspondence, detailed observations of suspicious behavior, and most damning of all, a complete timeline showing exactly when Dumbledore had learned about Peter Pettigrew's betrayal and what he had chosen to do with that information. "According to this," Bones said, her voice tight with controlled anger as she read from one of Lily's files, "Albus Dumbledore was informed of Peter Pettigrew's suspicious activities on October 15th, 1981. The The Potter family wasn't killed until October 31st. 16 days, whispered Cornelius Fudge, who had insisted on being present for this revelation despite his obvious discomfort. He knew for 16 days and said nothing. Harry felt sick. Why? Bones continued reading from his mother's meticulous notes. According to Lily's observations, Dumbledore believed that the deaths of Harry's parents would create what he called a necessary symbol, a martyred family and a surviving child who could unite the wizarding world against Voldemort. He let my parents die to make me famous? Harry's voice cracked with disbelief. Not famous, McGonagall said, quietly from where she stood with the other Hogwarts representatives. Useful. He wanted to create a story that would inspire others to fight, and a child who would grow up believing that sacrifice for the greater good was not only necessary, but noble. The evidence was overwhelming. Lily had recorded conversations where Dumbledore spoke about acceptable losses and necessary sacrifices. She had documented instances where he withheld crucial information from Order members, making decisions about their lives without their knowledge or consent. Most chilling of all, she had transcribed a conversation where Dumbledore explicitly stated that Harry's survival of the killing curse would make him perfectly positioned to inspire future generations of resistance fighters. "There's more," Bones said grimly, opening another file. "Evidence about Sirius Black's case." Harry's breath caught. This was the first time anyone had explained to him who Sirius Black actually was, beyond the name Dumbledore had mentioned during his arrest. "Sirius Black was your father's best friend," McGonagall told him gently. "He was also your godfather. When your parents went into hiding, he was supposed to be their secret keeper for the Fidelius charm, but at the last minute they switched to Peter Pettigrew without telling anyone." "Why?" "Because they thought it would be safer if the Death Eaters were looking for the wrong person," Bones explained. "Sirius was the obvious choice. Everyone knew how close he was to your father. Peter was overlooked, considered too weak and cowardly to be trusted with something so important. But he was the traitor. Yes, and when Sirius realized what had happened, he went after Peter to bring him to justice. But Peter was ready for him." Bones pulled out another document. "According to your mother's investigation, Peter Pettigrew is an unregistered animagus. He can transform into a rat." Harry's blood turned to ice. A rat, like Scabbers, Ron's pet rat that had been with the Weasley family for 12 years, the same rat that had been present for every conversation Harry had had with Ron about his discoveries. "We need to find Ron," Harry said urgently. "Now." An hour later, they had cornered Peter Pettigrew in his rat form in the Gryffindor common room. The transformation, back to human form, forced by a spell from Professor McGonagall, revealed a small, cowering man with thinning hair and watery eyes who looked exactly like the photos in his mother's evidence files. "Please," Pettigrew whimpered as Aurors surrounded him. "I didn't have a choice. You know who would have killed me." "You had a choice," Harry said, his mother's words echoing in his memory. "You could have warned my parents. You could have refused to betray them. You could have told the truth instead of letting Sirius Black go to prison for your crimes." Under Veritaserum, Peter Pettigrew's testimony confirmed every one of Harry's mother's suspicions. He admitted to spying for Voldemort, to betraying the Potter's location, and most damning of all, to meeting with Dumbledore 3 days before the attack. "He knew," Pettigrew said, his voice flat and emotionless under the truth serum's influence. "Dumbledore knew I had turned. He told me to continue as planned, that my betrayal would serve a greater purpose. He said the Potter boy's survival would be worth the sacrifice of his parents." The revelation sent shockwaves through the wizarding world. Emergency sessions of the Wizengamot were called to address what the Daily Prophet termed the greatest scandal in magical governance in over a century. Dumbledore was stripped of all his titles and positions: Headmaster of Hogwarts, Chief Warlock of the Wizengamot, Supreme Mugwump of the International Confederation of Wizards. Professor McGonagall was appointed temporary headmistress of Hogwarts, while Amelia Bones became interim Minister for Magic to handle the crisis and oversee the investigation into how such massive corruption had been allowed to flourish. The entire structure of magical law enforcement will be reviewed, Bones announced in her first official statement. No one person will ever again be allowed to accumulate the kind of unchecked power that made these atrocities possible. But for Harry, the most important change was personal. With Peter Pettigrew's confession and the evidence from the vault, Sirius Black was not only cleared of all charges, but officially recognized as the victim of a massive miscarriage of justice. He was released from Azkaban and given full custody of Harry as his legal godfather. Harry met Sirius for the first time in Professor McGonagall's office 3 days after his release. The man who entered was thin and worn from his years in prison, but his eyes, the same grey eyes Harry remembered from old photographs, lit up with unmistakable joy when he saw his godson. "You look so much like James," Sirius said softly, his voice hoarse from disuse. "But you have Lily's eyes, and her mind, from what I've been told." "I'm sorry," Harry said, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. "I'm sorry you went to prison for something you didn't do. I'm sorry no one believed you were innocent." Sirius's face crumpled, and he pulled Harry into a fierce hug. "None of that was your fault, Harry. None of it. You were a baby, and you were being manipulated just as much as the rest of us." "But if I had figured it out sooner, if anyone should have figured it out sooner, it was me," Sirius interrupted. "I was the adult. I was supposed to protect you, and instead I spent 11 years in prison while you grew up with relatives who didn't love you." Professor Snape, who had been quietly observing from the corner of the office, spoke up. "Neither of you is responsible for Dumbledore's manipulations. He orchestrated a system where the truth was buried so deeply that it took extraordinary measures to uncover it." "Severus is right," McGonagall added, "and he deserves recognition for the role he played in protecting Harry. The Minister has officially cleared your record, Severus, and acknowledged that your actions were heroic rather than suspicious." Harry looked at Snape with new understanding. "You were protecting me all along, weren't you? Not just from other threats, but from Dumbledore himself." "I was honoring a promise I made to your mother," Snape said quietly. "She asked me to watch over you, to make sure that if anyone tried to use you as Dumbledore had used others, there would be someone in a position to stop it." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of another man Harry didn't recognize, tall and thin, with greying brown hair and kind eyes that looked familiar somehow. "Remus Lupin," Sirius said, with the first genuine smile Harry had seen from him. "Harry, this is your father's other best friend. Moony, meet your honorary nephew." Remus Lupin studied Harry with eyes that were both sad and proud. "You've accomplished something remarkable, Harry. Your parents would be incredibly proud of what you've done." "You knew them?" "I was at school with them. James, Lily, Sirius, and—" Lupin's expression darkened. "And Peter. We called ourselves the Marauders. I should have seen what Peter was becoming, should have noticed the signs." "No one saw it clearly except my mother," Harry said. "And she tried to warn people, but they didn't listen." "Actually," Lupin said carefully, "some of us did listen. But we were overruled by higher authorities who insisted they knew better." Over the next several hours, Lupin helped verify much of the evidence from Lily's vault. He confirmed that there had been suspicions about Peter, that several Order members had raised concerns about information security, and that all of these concerns had been dismissed by Dumbledore as paranoia or insufficient trust in their fellow members. "The Order of the Phoenix is being disbanded," Bones informed them, later that evening. "We're investigating every member to determine who was complicit and who was simply deceived. Those who acted in good faith will be cleared, but anyone who enabled Dumbledore's methods will face appropriate consequences." "What about the war?" Harry asked. "Voldemort is still out there." "Voldemort's power was broken when he failed to kill you as an infant," Sirius explained. "What's left of him is weakened and scattered. The greater threat was always the corruption within our own institutions." As the days passed and more evidence came to light, the scope of Dumbledore's manipulations became clear. He had orchestrated not just the betrayal of the Potter family, but an entire system of information control and decision-making that had affected hundreds of lives over several decades. Families had been broken apart, children had been placed in harmful situations, and entire communities had been manipulated to serve his vision of the greater good. "The rebuilding will take years," McGonagall told Harry during one of their regular check-ins. "But for the first time in decades, we have the opportunity to create a system based on transparency and genuine protection rather than manipulation and control." "Will things actually be better?" "I believe they will," McGonagall said firmly, "because people like you and your friends have shown that it's possible to question authority, to seek truth, and to stand up for what's right, even when it's difficult." That night, as Harry sat in Sirius's temporary quarters at Hogwarts, they would be moving to the rebuilt Black family home after the term ended. He reflected on everything that had changed. His parents had been avenged, his godfather had been freed, and the man who had orchestrated so much suffering was finally facing justice. "Do you think my mother knew how it would end?" he asked Sirius, who was reading nearby. "I think your mother prepared for every possibility she could imagine," Sirius replied. "But more than that, I think she trusted you to make the right choices when the time came." Harry touched the locket that still hung around his neck, now quiet, but still warm with his mother's love. "She said there was always another choice. And you proved her right. You chose truth over comfortable lies, you chose to protect your friends instead of using them, and you chose to expose corruption even when it would have been easier to ignore it." As Harry drifted off to sleep that night, surrounded by family for the first time in his life, he felt something he'd never experienced before. The peace that came from knowing that the truth had finally won, and that the people he loved were safe not because they had been manipulated into safety, but because they had chosen to protect each other. The work of rebuilding would continue, but the foundation had been laid, and for the first time since arriving at Hogwarts, Harry Potter was looking forward to a future where his choices would truly be his own. Chapter 11. New Beginnings. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of number 12 Grimmauld Place, illuminating the dust motes that danced in the air as Harry descended the stairs for breakfast. 6 months had passed since Dumbledore's arrest. 6 months since the wizarding world had been turned upside down by the revelations about corruption and manipulation at the highest levels of government. 6 months since Harry Potter had finally come home. "Morning, Harry," Sirius called from the kitchen, where he was wrestling with what appeared to be a particularly temperamental magical stove. "Remus went to the ministry early. Another committee meeting about the new child protection legislation." Harry smiled as he settled at the kitchen table. The transformation of Grimmauld Place, from the dark, oppressive house it had been to a warm family home, was still ongoing. But every day brought new changes. The screaming portrait of Sirius's mother had been permanently silenced. The house elf heads had been removed from the walls. And most importantly, laughter now echoed through rooms that had been silent for decades. "Any word from Ron and Hermione?" Harry asked, accepting a plate of eggs and bacon that was only slightly burnt. "Hermione's letter arrived this morning," Sirius said, settling across from him with his own breakfast. "She and her parents are visiting Diagon Alley today. The Grangers are still adjusting to the magical world, but they're fascinated by everything. The integration of Hermione's parents into the magical community had been one of the positive outcomes of the investigation. When the truth about Harry's situation had come to light, the Ministry had implemented new policies requiring that Muggle-born students' families receive comprehensive education about the wizarding world, including their rights and protections under magical law. Dr. and Mrs. Granger have been asking excellent questions about magical education and child welfare, Sirius continued. Hermione gets her analytical mind from both sides, apparently. Harry grinned. Even in the depths of the investigation, Hermione had remained true to form, researching everything she could about institutional reform and magical law. Her parents' involvement had only encouraged her natural inclinations toward systematic thinking. What about the Weasleys? Sirius's expression grew more serious. Arthur is still struggling with everything that's come to light. He genuinely believed in Dumbledore, and discovering that his trust was misplaced has been difficult for him. But Molly has been a force to be reckoned with. She's been working with the new ministry committees to ensure that no family ever goes through what yours did. The Weasley family's response to the revelations had been complex. Arthur Weasley had been deeply shaken by the discovery that his loyalty to Dumbledore had been exploited, but he had channeled that shock into determination to help rebuild the system properly. Ron had confided to Harry that his father spent most evenings reading through proposed reforms, taking his responsibility to understand the new policies very seriously. Speaking of families, Sirius said carefully, I had a visitor yesterday while you were out with your friends. Augusta Longbottom came by. Harry looked up with interest. Neville's grandmother had become an unexpected ally in the aftermath of the investigation, and her stories about the old pureblood family's concerns about Dumbledore's methods had provided valuable context for understanding how deeply the corruption had run. What did she want? To thank you, actually, and to tell you something about your mother that I thought you should hear. Sirius leaned back in his chair. Augusta told me that Lily had contacted her several times in the months before her death. Apparently, your mother was building a network of parents who were concerned about how their children were being used in the war effort. Harry felt a familiar warmth in his chest, the same feeling he got whenever he learned something new about his mother's strategic thinking. She wasn't just protecting you, Sirius continued. She was trying to protect all the children who might be caught up in Dumbledore's plans. Augusta said Lily had lists of families to contact, contingency plans for getting children to safety, even legal documents prepared to challenge the ministry's authority to separate families for security reasons. She was building a resistance within the resistance, Harry said quietly. Exactly. And according to Augusta, it's working. The new child protection laws that Remus is helping to draft are based largely on principles that Lily outlined in her letters to concerned parents. Harry finished his breakfast in thoughtful silence. Even months after discovering his mother's portrait and her careful preparations, he was still learning about the scope of her planning. She had seen further than just her own family's immediate danger. She had recognized that the problems were systemic and had tried to address them at that level. Later that morning, Harry met Ron and Hermione at the Leaky Cauldron for their regular weekly visit. The friendship between the three of them had only grown stronger since the investigation ended, built now on a foundation of complete honesty rather than the careful secrecy that had characterized their first year. You look happy, Hermione observed as they settled into their usual corner booth. I am happy, Harry realized with some surprise. For the first time in my life, I actually am. It shows, Ron agreed. My mum says you look like a completely different person than you did last Christmas. I feel like a completely different person. Living with Sirius and Remus, it's like having a real family. They tell me stories about my parents. They help me with magic. They ask me what I want to do, rather than telling me what I have to do. Speaking of magic, Hermione said, pulling out a thick volume, I've been researching advanced protective charms. After everything we went through, I want to make sure we're prepared for whatever comes next. Always studying, Ron teased, but his tone was affectionate. though I suppose it paid off last year. It did more than pay off, Harry said seriously. Hermione, your research literally saved lives. Not just ours, but all the children whose families were being manipulated. Hermione blushed but looked pleased. It felt good to use what I'd learned for something important. My parents are amazed by how much practical application there is for theoretical magical knowledge. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a small owl carrying a letter addressed to Harry. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but the message inside made Harry's eyes fill with tears. "Dear Harry Potter," he read aloud. "My name is Susan Bones, and I'm Amelia Bones's niece. My aunt told me about what you did to expose the truth about your parents, and about how the ministry had been failing to protect children. I wanted you to know that because of your investigation, my aunt was able to help my family get custody of me from relatives who didn't want me. I have a real home now, just like you do. Thank you for being brave enough to ask the difficult questions. Your friend, Susan." "That's the 4th letter like that this week," Hermione said softly. "Word is spreading about what really happened, and families are using the new laws to protect their children." "Your mother would be so proud," Ron added quietly. That afternoon, Harry made a decision he'd been contemplating for months. With Sirius's support, he travelled to Godric's Hollow to visit his parents' grave for the first time since their deaths. The cemetery was peaceful, shaded by old trees and filled with the gentle sounds of birds and rustling leaves. When they found the headstone marking James and Lily Potter's final resting place, Harry stood quietly for several minutes, feeling the weight of everything that had happened since that October night 11 years ago. "I brought you something, Mum," he said finally, pulling out the locket that had been his constant companion for nearly a year. "I don't need this anymore. You gave me everything I needed to find the truth and make my own choices. Now I want to leave it here, where it belongs." He placed the locket gently on the grave, feeling a sense of completion as he did so. The warmth he'd grown accustomed to didn't fade completely. He could still feel his mother's love. But it no longer came from the magical artifact. It came from the understanding of who she had been and what she had given him. "Thank you," he whispered, "for everything." As the summer progressed, Harry received regular updates about the ongoing reforms at Hogwarts. Professor McGonagall had implemented sweeping changes to ensure student safety and transparency in all school operations. The new policies required that any dangerous situations be immediately reported to both the ministry and to students' guardians, and gave students explicit rights to refuse to participate in activities they deemed unsafe. Professor Snape had returned to teaching, but his relationship with Harry had transformed completely, no longer needing to maintain his cover as a harsh, biased teacher. Snape had begun giving Harry advanced lessons in defensive magic and potion-making. The man who had once seemed to despise Harry was revealed to be one of his most dedicated protectors. "Your mother would have been fascinated by this particular variant of the Protean charm," Snape said during one of their summer tutoring sessions. "She always believed that defensive magic should be elegant as well as effective." "Was she a good student?" Harry asked. "She was an exceptional student. But more than that, she was a good person who refused to accept that cruelty and manipulation were necessary parts of fighting evil." Snape's expression softened slightly. "She believed that how you fight matters as much as what you're fighting for. I think the changes happening now would please her." As August arrived, and Harry prepared for his second year at Hogwarts, he reflected on how much had changed. The wizarding world was still healing from the revelations about Dumbledore's actions, but the new institutions being built were stronger and more transparent than what they had replaced. More importantly, Harry was returning to school, not as the boy who lived, a symbol to be managed and manipulated, but as Harry Potter, a student with friends and family who cared about his welfare rather than his usefulness. Ready for another year? Sirius asked as they prepared to leave for King's Cross Station. More ready than I've ever been, Harry replied honestly. He had his books, his supplies, and most importantly, his knowledge of who he really was and what he was capable of when he chose his own path. His mother's greatest gift hadn't been her sacrifice on that Halloween night 11 years ago. It had been her careful preparation that allowed Harry to discover the truth and make his own choices about his future. As the Hogwarts Express pulled away from the platform, Harry waved goodbye to Sirius and Remus with a light heart. For the first time in his life, he was leaving home to go to school, rather than fleeing a prison to find one. The difference, he reflected, as London disappeared behind them, was everything. "So," Hermione said as she settled into their compartment, followed by Ron and Neville, "ready to see what Hogwarts is like when it's actually focused on education instead of manipulation?" Harry grinned, looking around at his friends who knew the truth about him and chose to stand beside him anyway. "I can't wait to find out." Outside the window, the British countryside rolled past, under a clear blue sky, and Harry Potter, no longer the boy who lived, but simply a boy who was living, looked toward his future with hope and anticipation instead of dread and confusion. His mother had given him the tools to find his own way. Now it was time to see where that path would lead. Chapter 12. Lily's Legacy. September 1st, 1992 dawned clear and bright, and Harry Potter woke in his own room at Grimmauld Place to the sound of Sirius making breakfast downstairs and Remus reading the morning paper aloud. For a moment, he simply lay in bed, marveling at the ordinary miracle of belonging somewhere. Exactly 1 year ago, he had been a frightened 11-year-old with no understanding of who he really was or why his life had been shaped by forces beyond his control. Today, he was returning to Hogwarts as someone who had not only discovered the truth about his past, but had actively shaped his own future. "Ready for year 2?" Sirius asked, as Harry joined him in the kitchen, where a proper breakfast waited alongside his packed trunk. "More than ready," Harry replied, accepting a cup of tea and settling into his chair. "I'm actually excited to see what Hogwarts is like when it's focused on education instead of manipulation." "Professor McGonagall's letters suggest you're going to find quite a different school," Remus added, looking up from the Daily Prophet. "The new policies she's implemented sound revolutionary. Mandatory transparency in all school decisions, student advocates for any dangerous situations, and regular communication with families about educational plans." As they travelled to King's Cross Station, Harry reflected on how different this departure felt from any he'd experienced before. He wasn't fleeing an unhappy situation or being sent away by people who resented his presence. He was leaving home temporarily to continue his education with the knowledge that people who loved him would be waiting for his return. At platform 9 3/4, the changes in the wizarding world were immediately apparent. Families moved through the station with a different energy, more relaxed, more open, more willing to ask questions and expect answers. Harry overheard parents discussing new ministry policies with their children, explaining their rights and protections rather than simply sending them off with vague reassurances. "Harry!" Hermione's voice carried across the platform, and he turned to see her approaching with her parents and a beaming smile. "Dr. and Mrs. Granger, this is Harry. We've heard so much about you," Dr. Granger said, shaking Harry's hand warmly. "Hermione tells us that what you did last year changed everything for Muggle-born families." "What we did," Harry corrected gently. None of it would have been possible without Hermione's research and analysis. "And what you did changed everything for all magical children," Mrs. Granger added. "The new policies requiring comprehensive family education and protection, they give us confidence that Hermione is truly safe at school." As they boarded the Hogwarts Express, Harry was struck by the different atmosphere among the students. There was less anxiety, less of the careful watching and whispered conversations that had characterized his first year. Students seemed more willing to ask questions, more confident that their concerns would be heard. In their compartment, Ron arrived with news from his family. "Dad's been appointed to the new Ministry Oversight Committee," he announced proudly. "Mum says he's never been happier with his work. He feels like he's actually protecting people instead of just managing bureaucracy." "And how are you feeling about everything?" Hermione asked Ron carefully. The Weasley family's adjustment to the revelations about Dumbledore had been ongoing, with each family member processing the betrayal of their trust differently. "Better," Ron said honestly. It hurt, finding out that someone we'd trusted so completely had been using that trust for his own purposes. But seeing how much good has come from exposing the truth, it helps, and knowing that my family is part of building something better makes a difference. When they arrived at Hogwarts, the changes were immediately visible. The castle looked the same, but it felt different, warmer, more welcoming, more like a place designed for learning rather than testing. Professor McGonagall greeted the returning students with a speech about the new year that emphasized curiosity, questioning, and mutual support rather than blind obedience and house rivalry. "Students," she announced to the Great Hall, "this year we begin a new chapter in Hogwarts' history. Our policies now require that every student understands not just what they're learning, but why they're learning it. You have the right to ask questions, to seek clarification, and to request family involvement in any decision that affects your education or safety." During the sorting ceremony, Harry watched the first-year students with new eyes. These children were arriving at a school that had been fundamentally reformed because of the truth that he and his friends had uncovered. They would never face the kind of manipulation and secrecy that had characterized his first year. After the feast, as the houses were dismissed to their dormitories, Professor McGonagall approached Harry with a request that surprised him. "Mr. Potter," she said, "I wonder if you might be willing to speak to the first-year Gryffindors tomorrow evening about the importance of asking questions and thinking critically about what they're told." "You want me to talk to them about what happened last year?" "I want you to talk to them about the choices they have," McGonagall clarified. "About the fact that they don't have to accept everything they're told without question, and that seeking truth is not just acceptable but admirable." The next evening, Harry found himself sitting in the Gryffindor common room with a group of 11-year-olds who looked exactly as lost and overwhelmed as he had felt just 1 year ago. But there was something different in their faces. Less fear, more curiosity. "Professor McGonagall asked me to talk to you about asking questions," Harry began, feeling unexpectedly nervous. "A year ago, I was sitting exactly where you are now, and I thought I had to accept everything I was told without questioning it. I thought that was what being a good student meant." He looked around at their attentive faces and continued. "But I learned something important. Asking questions isn't disrespectful or troublemaking. It's how you make sure that the people responsible for your safety are actually keeping you safe, and that the people teaching you are actually teaching you what you need to know." One brave first year raised her hand. "But what if the adults get angry when we ask questions?" "Then they're the wrong adults to be making decisions about your life," Harry said firmly. "The adults who truly care about you will welcome your questions because they want you to understand and feel secure. Anyone who gets angry at you for asking reasonable questions about your own welfare is someone you should be cautious about trusting." As the weeks passed, Harry settled into a rhythm at Hogwarts that felt entirely different from his first year. Professor Snape continued to teach him advanced defensive magic and potion-making, but now their lessons were conducted openly, with Snape explaining not just what Harry should learn, but why it was important for his protection. "Your mother's approach to protective magic was always strategic," Snape told him during one of their sessions. "She didn't just react to threats, she anticipated them and prepared accordingly. That gift for strategic thinking is something you've clearly inherited." "Do you think she knew how it would all turn out?" "I think she prepared for every possibility she could imagine and trusted that you would make good choices when faced with situations she couldn't anticipate. Snape's expression softened slightly. She would be proud of the young man you're becoming, Harry. Someone who protects others, instead of using them. Throughout the autumn term, letters continued to arrive from children and families across magical Britain. Parents thanked Harry for exposing the corruption that had put their children at risk. Young witches and wizards wrote to tell him how the new policies had improved their situations. Most touching of all were the letters from children who had been in harmful placements and were now living with families who truly cared for them. As winter approached and Christmas holidays drew near, Harry began a new project that felt like a natural extension of everything he had learned. He started keeping a detailed journal, documenting not just his own experiences, but the broader changes that were happening in the magical world as a result of his mother's preparations and the investigation they had enabled. "Why are you writing all this down?" Hermione asked one evening, finding him in the library with his journal and several history books. "Because my mother prepared for me to understand what had happened, but she couldn't prepare for every future situation," Harry explained. "I want to leave something that will help other children who might face similar problems. Information about how to ask the right questions, how to build alliances, how to challenge authority when authority is wrong." "You're creating a manual for future resistance," Hermione said, with understanding and admiration. "I'm creating a manual for future protection," Harry corrected, "so that other children won't have to figure out on their own that they have choices." As December 23rd approached, the anniversary of the night he had first entered the third-floor corridor to face Quirrell and Voldemort, Harry reflected on how much had changed. The portrait of his mother, now permanently displayed in the Potter Vault at Gringotts, had become something of a pilgrimage site for parents seeking to understand how to protect their children without controlling them. Professor McGonagall had told him that families from across Europe were visiting the vault, asking Lily's portrait for guidance on building support networks and preparing protective contingencies. His mother's legacy was extending far beyond Harry himself, touching the lives of children she had never met, but whose welfare she had tried to secure through her strategic planning. On Christmas Eve, as Harry packed his trunk to return home to Grimmauld Place for the holidays, he added one final entry to his journal. "My mother's greatest gift to me wasn't her sacrifice on Halloween night 11 years ago, though that sacrifice saved my life. Her greatest gift was understanding that love takes many forms, and that the most powerful protection comes from preparing people to make their own choices rather than making choices for them. She could have simply hidden me away and hoped for the best. Instead, she built networks, gathered evidence, created contingencies, and prepared tools that would help me discover the truth when I was old enough to understand it. She protected me, not by controlling my circumstances, but by ensuring I would have what I needed to navigate those circumstances myself. That's the kind of protection I want to offer to the children who come after me. Not the promise that they'll never face difficult choices, but the knowledge and support they'll need to make those choices wisely." As the Hogwarts Express pulled into King's Cross Station, Harry saw Sirius and Remus waiting on the platform with expressions of joy and welcome that still took his breath away. A year ago, he had been an orphan with no understanding of family. Now he was someone's chosen son, returning home to people who loved him for who he was, rather than what he represented. "How was the term?" Sirius asked as they made their way through the station. "Educational," Harry replied with a grin. "In all the best ways." "And how are you feeling about everything?" Remus added. "The anniversary of last year's events, the changes that have happened, your role in all of it?" Harry considered the question as they walked toward the exit, surrounded by other families reuniting for the holidays. "I feel like I understand something important about choice and protection and family, and I feel ready to keep learning." That evening, as they sat around the fireplace at Grimmauld Place with mugs of hot chocolate and plans for the holidays, Harry reflected on the circular nature of protection. His mother had protected him through strategic planning and careful preparation. He had used those tools to protect himself and his friends. Now he was preparing tools that would help future children protect themselves and each other. It wasn't a burden or a destiny. It was a choice, the same choice his mother had made, and the same choice that every person who truly loved children would make when given the opportunity. As snow began to fall outside the windows of his family home, Harry Potter, no longer just the boy who lived, but a boy who had learned how to truly live, looked toward the future with confidence, surrounded by love, and committed to ensuring that other children would have the same opportunities for choice and protection that his mother's legacy had given him. The game was over. The choices ahead were his own, and for the first time in his life, that prospect filled him, not